What's up, night owls? Welcome back to Demon Sleep. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I personally read every single one of them, and honestly, it makes my day seeing you all from around the world. If these dark tailies help you drift off or just escape reality for a bit, smash that like button and subscribe. But only if you think we've earned it. No pressure. Alright, lights off. Rain on, blankets up. Let's dive into tonight's nightmare fuel. Story 1. His shadow slept beside me. The walls were the color of forgetting. Not white, not cream, something in between. A shade designed to erase itself from memory the moment you looked away. Everything in the Riverside Care Center carried that same deliberate blandness. Tables without sharp edges, chairs that couldn't tip, a TV bolted to the ceiling like a prisoner watching its captors. Margaret Corso, though some mornings that name felt like it belonged to someone else, sat by a window that framed 3 trees. They stood in a pattern that once meant something. A triangle, a code, a message she'd understood years ago, back when understanding came easy. Now she could barely hold onto her daughter's face. But there was one thing that never left her. One memory that carved through the fog with surgical precision. The send. It arrived after dark, after the pills, after the hallway lights faded from their harsh white glare into that sickly amber glow that made everything look like it was drowning. Smoke and something roasting, hair burning, and beneath it all, hidden like a secret, something disturbingly sweet. Wrong sweet. The kind that made her throat close. She'd told them, God, she'd tried. Nurse Calloway, young and soft-voiced, had typed notes into her tablet with sympathetic nods. The other one, the name kept dissolving before Margaret could catch it, had adjusted her blankets and spoken in that sing-song tone reserved for toddlers and the dying. But Nurse Voss was different. Gray-haired, sharp-eyed, done with pretending. Your mind's unraveling, Mrs. Corso, she'd said flatly. Happens to everyone eventually. Except minds don't leave evidence. Margaret had woken 3 nights running with her arms streaked in ash. Actual ash. Black-gray smudges that stained the white sheets like accusations. She'd shown them, held out her trembling hands as proof. They'd shined lights, taken photos, called Dr. Rahman, who'd scribbled something about tactile delusions and stress-induced dermatographics before doubling her medication. They'd stripped the bed without meeting her eyes. They'd never explained why the stains wouldn't wash out completely. Tonight, Margaret didn't sleep. She lay frozen, watching the door. The lock was pathetic. A flimsy latch meant to keep wandering patients from getting lost, not to keep anything out. And something was definitely trying to get in. The walls were the color of forgetting. Not white, not cream, something in between. A shade designed to erase itself from memory the moment you looked away. Everything in the Riverside Care Center carried that same deliberate blandness. Tables without sharp edges, chairs that couldn't tip, a TV bolted to the ceiling like a prisoner watching its captors. Margaret Corso, though some mornings that name felt like it belonged to someone else, sat by a window that framed 3 trees. They stood in a pattern that once meant something. A triangle, a code, a message she'd understood years ago, back when understanding came easy. Now she could barely hold onto her daughter's face. But there was one thing that never left her. One memory that carved through the fog with surgical precision. The send. It arrived after dark, after the pills, after the hallway lights faded from their harsh white glare into that sickly amber glow that made everything look like it was drowning. Smoke and something roasting, hair burning. And beneath it all, hidden like a secret, something disturbingly sweet. Wrong sweet. The kind that made her throat close. She told them, God, she'd tried. Nurse Calloway, young and soft-voiced, had typed notes into her tablet with sympathetic nods. The other one, the name kept dissolving before Margaret could catch it, had adjusted her blankets and spoken in that sing-song tone reserved for toddlers and the dying. But Nurse Voss was different, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, done with pretending. Your mind's unraveling, Mrs. Corso, she'd said flatly. Happens to everyone eventually. Except minds don't leave evidence. Margaret had woken 3 nights running with her arms streaked in ash. Actual ash. Black-gray smudges that stained the white sheets like accusations. She'd shown them, held out her trembling hands as proof. They'd shined lights, taken photos, called Dr. Rahman, who'd scribbled something about tactile delusions and stress-induced dermatographics before doubling her medication. They'd stripped the bed without meeting her eyes. They'd never explained why the stains wouldn't wash out completely. Tonight, Margaret didn't sleep. She lay frozen, watching the door. The lock was pathetic, a flimsy latch meant to keep wandering patients from getting lost, not to keep anything out. And something was definitely trying to get in. The overhead lights had dimmed to their nocturnal pulse. The TV standby indicator burned crimson in the darkness, a single watchful eye. Beyond her walls, Riverside's nightly symphony played out in fragments. Mrs. Chen in 7B, sobbing for a son who'd stopped coming months ago. Mr. Davis shuffling past, his walker's rubber caps whispering against tile. Someone's television hissing static from a dead channel, filling the air with electric snow. The odor crept in slowly, like distant wildfire smoke drifting across miles. Just a trace at first, barely enough to register. Then it thickened, intensified, invaded every corner until the room reeked with horrible clarity. Not campfire, not autumn leaves, not any benign thing that burns. This was organic matter breaking down under extreme heat, muscle fibers contracting, tissue blistering, fat rendering into liquid. This was the unmistakable reek of human remains combusting. The air itself changed, not the gentle warmth of radiators kicking on, but something fierce and desiccating. Heat that sucked the moisture from her eyes and turned her tongue to sandpaper. Margaret's fingers dug into the bedding. She'd stopped pressing the call button nights ago. What was the point? By the time staff arrived, bleary and annoyed, the phenomenon would have vanished. They'd find her hysterical and incoherent, exactly what they expected from someone whose brain was eating itself alive. So she waited for what always came next. The sound of something moving against the floor. Not footsteps. Footsteps required upright posture, bipedal mechanics, the normal architecture of human movement. This was something else. A heavy, moisture-slicked scraping. The friction of burned skin against cold tile, accompanied by sharp crackles, like over-dried leather splitting apart, like ancient paper crumbling to dust. It was in the corridor now, approaching with the slow inevitability of rising floodwater, of encroaching darkness, of death. Margaret's lungs seized. She tried to scream, but her windpipe had collapsed. Tried to flee, but her muscles had betrayed her. The disease had stolen everything. Her children's names, the street she'd lived on for 3 decades. The woman she used to see reflected back at her. But terror, that remained untouched, crystalline, perfect. The one thing her dying brain refused to let go. The handle rotated with a harsh metallic shriek that split the amber-soaked silence. The door drifted open. For several heartbeats, nothing emerged. The doorway simply gaped, a dark throat framed by the corridor's sickly glow. creating a silhouette around something Margaret's sanity refused to process into recognizable form. Then it moved, and the movement violated every instinct coded into her DNA, bypassed conscious thought entirely, and activated something primitive, something that understood on a cellular level that what approached was fundamentally wrong. The walls were the color of forgetting. Not white, not cream, something in between, a shade designed to erase itself from memory the moment you looked away. Everything in the Riverside Care Center carried that same deliberate blandness. Tables without sharp edges, chairs that couldn't tip, a TV bolted to the ceiling like a prisoner watching its captors. Margaret Corso, though some mornings that name felt like it belonged to someone else, sat by a window that framed 3 trees. They stood in a pattern that once meant something, a triangle, a code, a message she'd understood years ago, back when understanding came easy. Now she could barely hold onto her daughter's face. But there was one thing that never left her, one memory that carved through the fog with surgical precision. The send. It arrived after dark, after the pills, after the hallway lights faded from their harsh white glare into that sickly amber glow that made everything look like it was drowning, smoke and something roasting, hair burning, and beneath it all, hidden like a secret, something disturbingly sweet, wrong sweet, the kind that made her throat close. She'd told them, God, she'd tried. Nurse Calloway, young and soft-voiced, had typed notes into her tablet with sympathetic nods. The other one, the name kept dissolving before Margaret could catch it, had adjusted her blankets and spoken in that sing-song tone reserved for toddlers and the dying. But Nurse Voss was different, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, done with pretending. Your mind's unraveling, Mrs. Corso, she'd said flatly. Happens to everyone eventually. Except minds don't leave evidence. Margaret had woken 3 nights running with her arms streaked in ash. Actual ash. Black-gray smudges that stained the white sheets like accusations. She'd shown them, held out her trembling hands as proof. They'd shined lights, taken photos, called Dr. Rahman, who'd scribbled something about tactile delusions and stress-induced dermatographics before doubling her medication. They'd stripped the bed without meeting her eyes. They'd never explained why the stains wouldn't wash out completely. Tonight, Margaret didn't sleep. She lay frozen, watching the door. The lock was pathetic, a flimsy latch meant to keep wandering patients from getting lost, not to keep anything out. And something was definitely trying to get in. The overhead lights had dimmed to their nocturnal pulse. The TV's standby indicator burned crimson in the darkness, a single watchful eye. Beyond her walls, Riverside's nightly symphony played out in fragments. Mrs. Chen in 7B, sobbing for a son who'd stopped coming months ago. Mr. Davis shuffling past, his walker's rubber caps whispering against tile. Someone's television hissing static from a dead channel, filling the air with electric snow. The odor crept in slowly, like distant wildfire smoke drifting across miles. Just a trace at first, barely enough to register. Then it thickened, intensified, invaded every corner until the room reeked with horrible clarity. Not campfire, not autumn leaves, not any benign thing that burns. This was organic matter breaking down under extreme heat, muscle fibers contracting, tissue blistering, fat rendering into liquid. This was the unmistakable reek of human remains combusting. The air itself changed, not the gentle warmth of radiators kicking on, but something fierce and desiccating. Heat that sucked the moisture from her eyes and turned her tongue to sandpaper. Margaret's fingers dug into the bedding, She'd stopped pressing the call button nights ago. What was the point? By the time staff arrived, bleary and annoyed, the phenomenon would have vanished. They'd find her hysterical and incoherent, exactly what they expected from someone whose brain was eating itself alive. So she waited for what always came next. The sound of something moving against the floor. Not footsteps. Footsteps required upright posture, bipedal mechanics, the normal architecture of human movement. This was something else. A heavy, moisture-slicked scraping. The friction of burned skin against cold tile, accompanied by sharp crackles, like over-dried leather splitting apart, like ancient paper crumbling to dust. It was in the corridor now, approaching with the slow inevitability of rising floodwater, of encroaching darkness, of death. Margaret's lungs seized. She tried to scream, but her windpipe had collapsed. Tried to flee, but her muscles had betrayed her. The disease had stolen everything. Her children's names, the street she'd lived on for 3 decades, the woman she used to see reflected back at her. But terror, that remained untouched, crystalline, perfect. The one thing her dying brain refused to let go. The handle rotated with a harsh metallic shriek that split the amber-soaked silence. The door drifted open. For several heartbeats, nothing emerged. The doorway simply gaped, a dark throat framed by the corridor's sickly glow, creating a silhouette around something Margaret's sanity refused to process into recognizable form. Then it moved, and the movement violated every instinct coded into her DNA, bypassed conscious thought entirely and activated something primitive, something that predated language, something that understood on a cellular level that what approached was fundamentally wrong. It entered on all fours, but wrong, limbs contorting at impossible angles, joints hyperextending in ways that defied skeletal structure, each forward lurch accompanied by wet snaps and pops. The temperature spiked, became suffocating, pressed against her like a physical weight, and filled her mouth with the metallic tang of blood and burnt carbon. And the stench, God, the stench consumed everything, flooded her airways, coated her throat, penetrated her skin until she felt saturated by it, drowning in the reek of cremation. In the sickly fusion of corridor light and TV glow, Margaret finally saw it completely. Its flesh resembled charred meat, carbonized black in sections, raw and suppurating in others. Exposed bone gleamed white through gaps where skin had disintegrated entirely. What remained of its hands were twisted ruins, fingers welded together by melted connective tissue, nails obliterated, knuckles jutting through like broken machinery. The head lolled at a grotesque angle, neck clearly unable to support its weight. Through patchy remnants of what might have once been hair, skull showed through, pale curves of bone visible where scalp had simply burned away. But the face shattered whatever fragile grip Margaret still had on reality. The lower jaw dangled uselessly, mandible exposed through carbonized cheek tissue. One eye socket gaped empty, just a hollow cavity filled with shadow. The other contained something that wept continuously, carving clean rivulets through layers of chalk. Where a nose should have been, 2 ragged openings marked the center of its face. Lips had completely burned off, leaving teeth permanently bared in a rictus that resembled eternal screaming. Though no sound escaped its destroyed throat, it hauled itself toward her bed with agonizing deliberateness, leaving behind a trail of ash and something darker, something that glistened. The heat pouring off its body triggered immediate sweat across Margaret's face, made her bedding feel soaked and heavy. When it reached her bedside, it stopped. The sound it made, A gurgling, liquid attempt at respiration turned her blood to ice despite the oppressive temperature. Then it began climbing. The mattress sagged under its weight. Springs groaned in protest. Margaret's scream finally erupted, tearing from her chest in a sound she'd never made before. Animal, raw, pure. She tried scrambling backward, but the headboard trapped her. Tried kicking, but the sheets had become a straitjacket around her legs. It kept coming, kept dragging itself upward with those ruined appendages, leaving oily smears across the white linens, its body shedding fragments with each movement, flakes of carbonized flesh, beads of clear fluid, ash cascading like black snow. It reached for her, and when those fused claws made contact with her bare arms, Margaret felt heat like iron brands pressed directly against her skin, felt blisters threatening to erupt under that scorching grip. She struck at it wildly, her fists connected with something that felt simultaneously solid and fragile. Her fists landed against something that gave way like overripe fruit collapsing inward, soft, wrong, yielding in ways human tissue shouldn't yield. But it didn't stop. It hauled itself closer with a relentless drive that felt less like aggression and more like desperation, like starvation, like something Margaret's disintegrating mind couldn't even name because rational thought had abandoned her completely. Its face loomed inches from hers, and she saw everything she'd been trying not to see. Muscle tissue moving beneath gaps in carbonized skin, a tongue, swollen, blackened, grotesque, writhing among exposed teeth, the remaining eye clouding over with a milky film that resembled cooked egg white. The stench wasn't just surrounding her anymore. It had invaded her, become part of her cellular structure. She couldn't draw a single breath that wasn't saturated with the smell of burning flesh. Then its arms encircled her, pulled her against a chest that radiated furnace-level heat. The temperature seared through her thin nightgown, began cooking her alive from the outside in. But here's what shattered her completely. The embrace itself wasn't violent. Those fused, claw-like appendages didn't crush or tear. Instead, they held her with something that felt almost protective, gentle, like arms that meant to soothe rather than destroy. The tenderness of it was more horrifying than any brutality could have been. Margaret's screams escalated. Something in her throat tore from the force of it, and the creature held tighter, pressed its demolished face into the curve of her neck, and spoke. The words came garbled, mangled by the absence of lips and the ruin of its vocal cords, bubbling up through fluids and char. But they were definitely words, syllables that her terror-paralyzed brain couldn't process, sounds that might have been language once, before fire had reduced them to meaningless phonetic fragments. It whispered directly against her skin with breath that smelled like molten metal. She felt moisture on her neck, whether from its weeping wounds, her own blood, or something else entirely, she couldn't tell. She fought until her body simply quit, until her screams degraded into hoarse, broken gasps, until her limbs turned to dead weight and her vision started tunneling from lack of oxygen. And through every second of it, the thing held her, burned her, murmured its incomprehensible prayer into her ear like a lullaby. When the nurses finally burst in, responding to the call button she'd somehow triggered in her thrashing, though later she couldn't remember pressing it at all, they found her curled in a ball, shaking violently, soaked in sweat, arms coated in gray-black residue. They found the oily streaks across her bedding. They found the ash trail running from doorway to mattress. Nurse Calloway, crouching to examine the trail with her flashlight, discovered something else. Something small, dark, half buried in the ash. She plucked it up with latex-gloved fingers, held it toward the light. A fragment of something that made her breath catch. A fragment of metal, warped beyond recognition. Gold in color, or what used to be gold before extreme heat had liquefied it, then let it cool into a twisted nightmare of its former shape. Maybe a ring, a wedding band perhaps, subjected to temperatures that turned precious metal into molten liquid. Nurse Calloway rotated it in her palm. Her professional composure flickered, just for a second. Then she dropped it into the biohazard bag with the contaminated linens and ash-covered gloves, scribbled a note, unidentified foreign object, origin unclear, told herself it had probably been there for weeks, overlooked during previous cleanings, nothing whatsoever to do with Mrs. Corso's nighttime episodes. Except she knew better. Knew it in that deep, wordless way you know things that can't be spoken aloud, can't be documented in patient files or mentioned to coworkers without destroying your professional reputation. She sealed the bag and disposed of it without telling anyone about the ring. But they never found the creature itself. It had vanished, like it always did, gone before witnesses could arrive. Nurse Calloway wrapped her arms around Margaret while she sobbed, made soft, comforting sounds, promised her everything was fine, that she was safe, that it had only been a nightmare. But Margaret could feel the burns on her arms where it had gripped her, could feel her throat shredded from screaming, could taste ash coating her tongue like poison. And she knew with absolute certainty that it would return. It always returned. Daytime at Riverside followed a rigid schedule, designed to impose order on chaos, to manufacture the illusion of normalcy in a place where normal had become a distant fairy tale. 8 a.m., breakfast. Mid-morning, activities, chair yoga, memory therapy, or simply staring out windows at those 3 trees that form their eternal, meaningless triangle. Noon, lunch. Afternoon, mandatory rest. 5 p.m., dinner. Evening, entertainment. Bingo with prizes no one remembered winning. Movies from 40 years ago that triggered nothing but confusion. Visits from family members whose faces grew less familiar with each passing month. Margaret moved through these daily rituals like a ghost, obedient, compliant. She'd learned long ago that resistance changed nothing. She consumed whatever arrived on those beige plastic trays, attended activities even when she couldn't remember what they were or why she was there, smiled when staff smiled at her, frowned when they frowned, became a mirror reflecting back whatever expression they needed to see. But beneath the docile surface, beneath the agreeable mask she wore for their comfort, terror lived. Pure, constant, unrelenting. The other residents felt it. Mrs. Chen, who spent her waking hours calling for a son who died 15 years earlier, fell silent whenever Margaret entered a room. Her clouded eyes would track Margaret's movements with an expression that seemed almost like recognition, like sympathy, or perhaps like fear of catching whatever darkness had infected her. Mr. Davis, whose dementia expressed itself through endless monologues about a restaurant he may or may not have actually owned, steered his walker in exaggerated curves to avoid crossing her path. Even the sharper ones noticed. Mrs. Harrison, who still managed the daily crossword puzzle. Mr. Tanaka, who beat the volunteers at chess every Thursday. They both recognized that whatever was consuming Margaret Corso went deeper than ordinary cognitive decline. The The burns on her arms disappeared gradually, not healing, fading, like they'd existed in some impossible space between genuine injury and psychological manifestation, like they'd never been entirely real to begin with. Dr. Rahman examined them during his weekly rounds. His touch remained gentle as he palpated the discolored tissue. Then he increased her dosage. Again. He explained about psychosomatic injuries and nocturnal anxiety attacks in that measured, clinical tone that made everything sound reasonable. Margaret nodded, agreed, because arguing would only prove she'd lost her grip on reality. But she felt those burns, felt them when she moved, felt them when clothing grazed the damaged skin, felt them radiating heat that had nothing to do with biological inflammation and everything to do with something darker. Memory. God, that word had become complicated. She'd lost so much. The memories that stitched a life together, that created continuity between past and present and future. Faces of people she'd cherished had dissolved into vague impressions. Feelings without features. Places she'd inhabited now existed as disjointed snapshots. A yellow kitchen, a blue bedroom, a garden where something significant had occurred. But she couldn't remember what. The details had evaporated, leaving only emotional residue. The ache of loss without any specific understanding of what she'd actually lost. Yet certain memories persisted. And those were the cruelest ones. They ambushed her without warning. The smell of something overcooking in Riverside's kitchen would catapult her back to a house she couldn't visualize. Smoke billowing through a doorway. Heat that made the air ripple and blur. The wail of sirens on the street outside triggered cascades of sensation. Shattering glass, groaning wood, someone screaming a name that might have been hers. And sometimes, in that liminal space between unconsciousness and waking, she remembered a man. Not his face. Faces slipped through her mental grasp now like sand through an open hand. But his presence, the solid weight of him sharing her bed, the warmth radiating from his body. Though that warmth had become tangled in her mind with the other warmth, the burning warmth that visited after midnight. She remembered loving him. The emotion survived even though the person had been erased. A phantom emotion tethered to nothing, love with no destination, no recipient. She tried explaining him once to the facility counselor, a young woman whose name began with K or maybe C, someone whose optimistic face and ever-present clipboard suggested she still believed therapeutic intervention mattered in a place like this. But the words emerged mangled, twisted by her deteriorating brain into a chaotic mess about houses and flames, and someone who departed yet somehow remained. Someone who'd made a promise she could no longer retrieve from the wreckage of her memory. The counselor had nodded, typed notes, suggested that unresolved grief could manifest in peculiar ways. That bereavement sometimes created what she termed continuing bond hallucinations. Margaret stopped trying to explain after that. The nights deteriorated. The entity, she couldn't think of it as anything else anymore. Her mind categorically refused to classify it as human even though some buried part of her recognized it had been human once, arrived earlier each evening, lingered longer. The heat it radiated intensified until she woke each dawn completely saturated, sheets waterlogged, nightgown plastered to her skin. The ash on her arms migrated, spread to her shoulders, her torso, her face, until she gazed into the bathroom mirror and saw herself streaked like a coal miner, marked with residue that resisted washing. The staff noticed, impossible not to. but their explanations had crystallized into institutional gospel. Mrs. Corso was experiencing tactile and olfactory delusions, consistent with her neurological condition. The marks resulted from nocturnal self-scratching or age-related dermal fragility. The ash was either imagined or possibly remnants from the activated charcoal Dr. Rahman had prescribed for digestive issues. They perceived what they needed to perceive. Anything else would have forced them to interrogate the fundamental nature of reality, and that would have made their jobs impossible. On the 7th night, or perhaps the 17th, time had become fluid, days dissolving into one eternal present moment. Margaret lay waiting. The stench had already commenced its invasion, seeping beneath her door like poisonous vapor, temperature rising, corridor lights dimming to their nocturnal rhythm. But tonight felt different. Tonight, as the handle rotated and the creature hauled itself across her threshold, trailing ash and charred tissue, something shifted inside Margaret's fragmented consciousness. Not recognition. Her brain had lost the capacity for that kind of concrete identification, but a sudden awareness that her terror, while absolutely justified by what she witnessed, was somehow missing the actual point. The entity dragged itself bedward, as it always did. Heat radiated from it in pulsing waves. The stench threatened suffocation. But tonight, just for one crystalline instant before primal terror obliterated rational thought, she glimpsed something in that single fluid weeping eye that stopped her breath for an entirely different reason. Not hunger, not malice. Grief. Then it reached for her with those welded claw appendages, and the moment disintegrated. She was screaming again, fighting again, feeling burns bloom fresh across her arms beneath its scorching grip. But that image, that eye, persisted even through her terror, even through the garbled syllables bubbling from its ruined throat, even through the crushing embrace that felt like drowning in fire. Something was fundamentally wrong with this entire scenario. Something beyond the self-evident horror of a charred creature crawling into her bed each night. Something she was supposed to understand, but couldn't quite grasp. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday, or maybe Thursday. Margaret had abandoned any pretense of tracking time's linear progression. It was delivered by a woman claiming to be her daughter. The visitor had gentle eyes, graying hair pulled back, a voice that trembled when she spoke. Margaret couldn't attach a name to her, couldn't position her within whatever constellation of relationships had once structured her existence. But she accepted the connection as genuine because the alternative, that she was completely alone, felt unbearable. The woman stayed 60 minutes, attempted small talk that Margaret mostly couldn't follow, held her hand with a pressure that communicated pure desperation. Before departing, she retrieved an envelope from her purse and placed it on Margaret's bedside table. After the woman left, Margaret opened it with shaking fingers. Inside, a photograph, edges worn soft from years of handling. The image captured two people standing before a house, arms wrapped around each other, smiling at the camera with that unguarded happiness belonging to people who believed they had infinite time ahead of them. A man and a woman, middle-aged, summer clothing, sunlight making their faces radiant. Margaret studied the photograph for what felt like hours, her mind struggling to decode what she was seeing. The woman in the picture triggered vague familiarity, the way dream faces do. Recognizable on some instinctive level, but disconnected from concrete memory. But the man made her chest constrict. She couldn't articulate why. His features meant nothing to her analytically. The angle of his jaw, the curve of his smile, the silver threading through his temples. Her brain had long since lost its capacity to maintain any facial database. But something about him unleashed a cascade of emotion that transcended identification. Something that bypassed her shattered neural pathways entirely, went directly to her limbic system, those primitive structures governing attachment, fear, and love. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, written in handwriting she didn't recognize, 2 words: Margaret and Jack. Jack. The name landed like a stone dropped into dark water, creating ripples she could feel but couldn't interpret. It meant nothing. It meant everything. It meant something her diseased brain could no longer decode because the pathways required for understanding had been incinerated. She positioned the photograph on her nightstand, where she could see it from bed. And that night, when the entity arrived, dragging itself through her doorway with that wet, leathery scraping, bringing its apocalyptic heat and ash and nightmare, she forced herself to keep watching longer than usual before terror consumed her. Forced her eyes to stay open, to actually look at its devastated face, at that single eye constantly weeping clear fluid, at the exposed skull, the obliterated features. And for just a heartbeat, just a microsecond before her sanity fragmented into screaming, she saw it. A pattern, a resonance. The skull's underlying architecture beneath the carbonization. The positioning of the remaining eye. The way the creature's head angled, even in its ruination, even with vertebrae clearly damaged and dislocated. She knew that tilt. The moment evaporated. Terror surged back like a tidal wave. The entity wrapped its furnace arms around her and she fought as she always did, screamed until her vocal cords tore, felt heat searing through layers of skin. But beneath the horror, something new had taken root. A question. The following day dissolved into Riverside's mechanical routine. But the question persisted, growing in the shadows of Margaret's deteriorating mind like mold in a damp cellar. She stared at the photograph obsessively, trying to force her brain to construct bridges it no longer possessed the infrastructure to build. The man in the picture, the creature visiting nightly, the name scrawled on back that simultaneously meant nothing and everything. Jack. She attempted asking the nurses about him. The words emerged garbled, incoherent. But Nurse Calloway understood enough, pulled up Margaret's digital file on her tablet, scrolled to a section labeled Family. There a single notation: husband Jack Corso, deceased 2019, house fire. Deceased. The word suspended in the air like suspended ash. House fire. That night, Margaret left her bedside lamp burning, a small rebellion against darkness and whatever traveled with it. She gripped the photograph in both hands, edges creasing beneath the pressure. And when the stench commenced its approach, when temperature began spiking and that wet, dragging sound echoed down the corridor toward her room, she didn't look away. She watched the handle rotate, watched the door drift open, watched the entity haul itself across her threshold. Across her threshold, its charred form depositing trails of ash and debris with every agonizing movement. That single remaining eye locked onto her with an intensity that shouldn't have been possible given the catastrophic tissue damage. It advanced toward her bed as it always had, heat radiating in suffocating waves, the stench triggering her gag reflex. But tonight she didn't scream. Instead, she raised the photograph, and the entity stopped. for the first time since these visitations began, and she couldn't remember anymore whether that meant weeks or months, or if they'd always been happening. It halted mid-approach. The ruined head angled at that achingly familiar tilt. That single eye focused on the photograph with an expression Margaret's fractured mind struggled desperately to decode. Then it made a sound. Not the gurgling, liquid breathing it usually produced. Not the meaningless syllables bubbled through damaged vocal cords. This was different, deliberate, forced through destroyed anatomy with obvious excruciating effort. A name. Her name. Margaret. The word emerged fractured, broken into component sounds by the absence of lips, tongue, proper laryngeal structure, but unmistakable nonetheless. And hearing it, hearing her name spoken by this carbonized nightmare in the darkness, hearing the tenderness with which it shaped those syllables despite the physical impossibility of speech, something fundamental shifted inside Margaret's consciousness. Not memory. She traveled too far down that road of dissolution for restoration. But a different kind of knowing, an understanding that circumvented her damaged neural architecture entirely, went straight to something older, something the disease couldn't reach because it existed before language, before rational thought. The creature staring at her photograph with unbearable sorrow in its remaining eye. The creature that arrived every single night despite her screams. The creature that held her when she fought back, that whispered to her when she tried escaping, that returned again and again, no matter how violently she rejected it. The creature that reeked of ash and incinerated flesh because that's precisely what it was, what it had become, what it had died being. Jack, her husband, the man in the photograph, the man who'd made some promise she could no longer retrieve from the wreckage of her memory. The man who'd loved her with an intensity that survived death itself, survived burning, survived even this. The revelation should have brought comfort, should have transformed the horror into something bearable, should have allowed her to perceive the devotion beneath the nightmare. But it didn't, because she deteriorated too far. The disease had consumed too much. And even though some primitive part of her understood, truly understood, that this charred entity dragging itself to her bedside every night was doing so out of unwavering dedication, out of a vow honored beyond all reasonable boundaries, out of love that wouldn't accept death or physical destruction as obstacles. Her conscious mind couldn't hold that understanding, couldn't integrate it. The dementia had shredded the neural pathways required to transform terror into recognition, to see the husband beneath the horror. So when it reached for her again with those fused, blackened hands, when it pulled her against that furnace chest and whispered her name with a tenderness that should have broken her heart, she screamed anyway, fought anyway, felt the burns bloom across her skin anyway. Because knowing and accepting were two different things. And her dying brain could no longer bridge that distance. Jack held her through it all, just like he'd promised, just like he always would. Even if she'd never remember why. Across her threshold, its charred form depositing trails of ash and debris with every agonizing movement. That single remaining eye locked onto her with an intensity that shouldn't have been possible given the catastrophic tissue damage. It advanced toward her bed as it always had. Heat radiating in suffocating waves, the stench triggering her gag reflex. But tonight she didn't scream. Instead, she raised the photograph, and the entity stopped. for the first time since these visitations began, and she couldn't remember anymore whether that meant weeks or months, or if they'd always been happening. It halted mid-approach. The ruined head angled at that achingly familiar tilt. That single eye focused on the photograph with an expression Margaret's fractured mind struggled desperately to decode. Then it made a sound. Not the gurgling, liquid breathing it usually produced. Not the meaningless syllables bubbled through damaged vocal cords. This was different, deliberate, forced through destroyed anatomy with obvious excruciating effort. A name. Her name. Margaret. The word emerged fractured, broken into component sounds by the absence of lips, tongue, proper laryngeal structure, but unmistakable nonetheless. And hearing it, hearing her name spoken by this carbonized nightmare in the darkness, hearing the tenderness with which it shaped those syllables despite the physical impossibility of speech, something fundamental shifted inside Margaret's consciousness. Not memory. She traveled too far down that road of dissolution for restoration. But a different kind of knowing, an understanding that circumvented her damaged neural architecture entirely, went straight to something older, something the disease couldn't reach because it existed before language, before rational thought. The creature staring at her photograph with unbearable sorrow in its remaining eye. The creature that arrived every single night despite her screams. The creature that held her when she fought back, that whispered to her when she tried escaping, that returned again and again, no matter how violently she rejected it. The creature that reeked of ash and incinerated flesh because that's precisely what it was, what it had become, what it had died being. Jack, her husband, the man in the photograph, the man who'd made some promise she could no longer retrieve from the wreckage of her memory, the man who'd loved her with an intensity that survived death itself, survived burning, survived even this. But the understanding couldn't take root, couldn't establish permanence in soil already scorched barren. The moment dissolved like sugar in water. Terror surged back with renewed savagery. And when the creature, when Jack, reached for her with those welded, blackened appendages, when he hauled himself onto her mattress, when he wrapped those furnace arms around her trembling body and pressed what remained of his face against her throat and whispered her name with such careful, broken devotion, she screamed. Screamed because that's all her dying brain had left to offer. Because the disease wouldn't permit her to retain recognition for longer than heartbeats. Because every night was the first night. Every encounter a fresh introduction to horror. Her neural pathways too devastated to construct the continuity that would allow her to see him before panic obliterated everything else. She felt him clutch her tighter as she thrashed, felt moisture on her neck that she now understood, for this fleeting instant before comprehension evaporated again, was weeping. Impossible tears from a body that should have been incapable of producing them. Tears flowing from that single surviving eye. Because even deceased and incinerated and transformed into nightmare, he still retained enough humanity to shatter. And she grasped it, for this brief, crystalline moment before her mind reset itself once more, before dementia consumed the revelation as completely as flames had consumed his flesh. This was his damnation, not her nightly terror. His, coming to her every evening because he'd vowed she would never sleep alone. Holding her because honoring that promise was all he had left. Because love and commitment were the only fragments of himself that had survived combustion. enduring her screams and her strikes and her revulsion, because the alternative was abandoning his word, leaving her isolated in darkness. He knew she didn't recognize him, had to know. Every night he crawled to her bed, and every night she perceived only a monster and he came regardless. Every night he embraced her while she fought him, and he remained regardless. Every night he spoke to her in his demolished voice, and she heard only gibberish, and he spoke regardless, because loving her mattered more than being loved back, because the vow transcended his own suffering, because even death and fire and complete transformation into something from hell's darkest corner wasn't sufficient reason to break his promise. The photograph slipped from Margaret's trembling fingers, drifted to the floor beside her bed. Her screams degraded to whimpers, then to exhausted, broken silence. And Jack held her in the amber darkness, his charred arms wrapped protectively around her shaking form, his ruined face buried against her neck, enduring her terror, because it was the only way he still knew how to love her. Morning arrived with the nurse's footsteps in the corridor. They discovered her with ash smeared across her forearms and salt tracks dried on her face. They stripped her bedding, documented the incident in digital records, modified her pharmaceutical regimen once more. They offered her their practiced, professional compassion, assured her it had been nothing but nightmares, just another manifestation of her progressive condition, nothing warranting concern. And when darkness returned, he would return with it. He would always return, because that was the vow he'd made, because that was what love meant to him, because certain things persisted even through incineration, even through death, even through the complete annihilation of identity into ash and abomination. And because she would never retain awareness long enough to truly see him, never maintain recognition beyond those fleeting seconds before disease obliterated it again, she would spend whatever nights remained screaming in the embrace of a man who loved her beyond life itself, beyond death itself, beyond the unbearable torment of being forever mistaken for a monster by the only soul who'd ever mattered. The revelation arrived too late to change anything. Margaret had lost the neurological capacity to carry information across the barrier of sleep. Each dawn wiped the previous evening's comprehension away, left her with nothing but baseline dread and the nightmarish apparition that dragged itself through her doorway after midnight. The photograph persisted on her nightstand. Margaret and Jack, inscribed on its reverse in handwriting that had become as indecipherable as the faces captured in the image. Sometimes during daylight hours, she'd gaze at it with a vague sensation that it signified something important, that there was a connection waiting to be discovered. But the neural bridges required to complete that connection had long since disintegrated. The Riverside staff had abandoned attempts to explain the ash. It materialized with mechanical regularity now, marking her arms, her shoulders, her face, streaked across her linens, creating trails from doorway to bedside that suggested something massive and damaged hauling itself across tile. Dr. Rahman ordered comprehensive testing, blood work, toxicology panels, environmental assessments searching for carbon contamination sources. Results returned negative, inconclusive. Eventually, he stopped requesting them altogether. The human psyche possesses extraordinary capacity for normalizing abnormality. When the alternative demands confronting phenomena that refuse to fit within established paradigms of reality, it becomes easier to simply increase the frequency of linen changes, to document the persistent dermatological irregularities, and move forward. Some things cannot be explained. Some promises cannot be broken. Some love refuses to die. Even when death would be mercy. Even when the beloved no longer remembers your name. Even when every embrace is met with screaming. Jack kept his word. Night after night after night. Because that's what forever meant. Even in hell. Mrs. Harrison, who'd retained sufficient mental clarity to recognize when reality didn't align, mentioned the odor one afternoon in the common area. That acrid reek of ash and combusted protein had started permeating the hallways adjacent to Margaret's quarters, subtle during daylight hours but unmistakable after sunset, as though whatever generated it was gaining strength, growing bolder, less capable of remaining contained within the private nightmare of Margaret's room. Nurse Voss, when confronted, claimed it was likely a heating system malfunction, something about compromised ventilation. Maintenance was investigating. Nobody acknowledged that it was August. The nights established a rhythm, a grotesque ritual that repeated with variations, so microscopic they might have been hallucination. The stench would commence its invasion. Temperature would spike. That wet, leathery scraping of something hauling itself down the corridor. The door drifting open. The entity dragging itself bedward with patient, relentless resolve. And Margaret would scream. Some nights she resisted more violently than others. Some nights exhaustion claimed her immediately. Some nights she managed escaping the bed before it arrived, only to huddle in the corner while it pulled itself across the floor toward her hiding place. That single eye never wavering from her face, its destroyed mouth forming shapes that could have been language or could have been benedictions. But inevitably it reached her, wrapped those scorching arms around her trembling form, held her while she wept and thrashed, pressed that carbonized face against her throat, and whispered its careful, fractured Margaret into her ear. The only word it seemed capable of articulating with any precision. The only word significant enough to force its way through tissue damage and death and ash. And sometimes, not frequently, but occasionally, in those narrow windows before dementia reasserted control and obliterated comprehension once more, she would cease fighting, would actually feel the desperate pressure of those fused, claw-like appendages, would hear the grief saturating that gurgling, liquid voice, would detect the devotion beneath the horror, would remember, not his face, not his name, not the decades they'd shared or the vows they'd exchanged or the conflagration that had claimed him, but something more ancient than memory, something deeper than conscious thought. The sensation of being embraced by someone who would traverse burning buildings rather than abandon you to solitude. The awareness of a presence that had become so intrinsic to her existence that even death and neurological collapse and the complete disintegration of her capacity for recall couldn't entirely eradicate it. In those moments, in those fractional seconds, her screaming would cease. Her muscles would slacken infinitesimally within his grip, and she would produce a sound. Not quite articulation, just expelled breath that curved itself around half-formed consonants she couldn't fully shape. That could have been his name, could have been recognition, could have been nothing but random vocal noise. But then the window would slam shut. Disease would reclaim territory. Terror would cascade back like freezing water. And she'd be shrieking again, struggling again, perceiving only the nightmare and never the devotion, seeing only the monster and never the man. and he would tighten his embrace, would absorb her strikes and her horror, would remain until the first pale suggestion of dawn began bleeding through the window. When he would finally release her, with transparent reluctance dragging his devastated form back across the floor, depositing that trail of ash in his wake, slipping through the doorway and dissolving into whatever realm the deceased occupied when they weren't honoring impossible vows. The woman who might have been Margaret's daughter visited with decreasing frequency as months accumulated. The encounters had become unbearable, witnessing her mother's progressive dissolution, watching her fail to recognize a face that had once been as intimately known as her own reflection. During her final visit, she stood frozen in Margaret's doorway and openly wept. Margaret observed her with the courteous bewilderment of someone witnessing a stranger's private anguish. Before departing, the woman questioned Nurse Calloway about the ash. Calloway delivered the standardized explanation: dermatological irregularities, somatic manifestations of unresolved grief, the unpredictable ways cognitive decline could alter bodily chemistry. She spoke with the rehearsed conviction of someone who'd mastered sounding authoritative even while articulating complete nonsense. The woman stared at her for an extended moment, then at Margaret, then at the photograph resting on the nightstand, her parents decades earlier, before the fire consumed everything. And something crossed her expression that Nurse Calloway would contemplate for weeks afterward. Not skepticism exactly. Something worse. The recognition of a truth too terrible to verbalize. Then she pivoted and departed. She never returned. Margaret's remaining time, though time itself had become meaningless, reduced to cyclical repetition of daylight and darkness, routine and terror, forgetting and forgetting and forgetting, followed the established pattern. Her dementia advanced relentlessly. Her capacity for communication deteriorated beyond repair. The ash on her skin became indelible, resistant to even the most vigorous cleansing, as though it had penetrated beyond epidermis, had marked something fundamental beneath the surface. And every night, Jack arrived without fail. The ending, when it materialized, came without fanfare. No climactic confrontation, no supernatural revelation, no merciful release. Just the gradual dimming of systems that had been malfunctioning for years. The methodical shutdown of biological machinery that transformed Margaret Corso from a person into a collection of deteriorating organs and malfunctioning synapses. Dr. Rahman detected it first during morning rounds. Her respiratory pattern had shifted, had acquired that distinctive quality physicians learn to recognize instantly. Not labored precisely, but altered, inefficient, as though her body was losing the instructions for even its most fundamental operations. He ordered diagnostics, documented observations, contacted the emergency contact on file regarding palliative care and what to anticipate in the approaching days or hours. Margaret herself remained oblivious to the transition. She'd long since lost the cognitive framework to comprehend mortality. She inhabited a permanent present now, each instant self-contained, disconnected from history or future. Staff cycled through with their measured voices and tender touches. Fluorescent lights maintained their ceaseless vibration. The 3 trees in the courtyard continued their choreography of branches and foliage. And when darkness fell, Jack materialized. But something had transformed in his visitations now. Something the nurses might have observed if they'd been monitoring. if they'd possessed sufficient belief to actually watch. The desperation saturating his movements had amplified. The meticulous way he hauled himself bedward each evening now carried fresh intensity, as though he could sense what the physicians had detected, as though death could smell its own arrival. He embraced her longer now, remained until actual sunrise rather than merely its suggestion. And the sounds emerging from his ruined throat, those whispered attempts at speech bubbling through damaged tissue, carried a quality that would have shattered anyone capable of interpreting them as language rather than the wet vocalizations of nightmare. He was articulating farewell, not through words she could process. Her disease had progressed beyond the threshold where language retained meaning, even during those microseconds of partial awareness. But goodbye nonetheless, communicated through the anguished pressure of his grip. Through the desperate way, his carbonized face buried itself against her throat. Through tears that impossibly continued flowing from that single surviving eye. She screamed less frequently now, not because fear had diminished, but because she lacked the physical reserves for sustained terror. Her reactions had been ground down, worn smooth by endless repetition and advancing neurological decay. She still perceived the monster, still experienced visceral horror when that charred entity crawled into her bed. But the horror had achieved familiarity, had carved pathways in her consciousness deep enough that even her devastated brain could detect a recurring pattern, could comprehend on some primitive level that this was simply what nightfall meant now. Increasingly, she stopped resisting entirely, would simply lie motionless within his embrace while he clutched her and wept those impossible tears and murmured his fractured syllables. Would feel his heat, always that scorching heat, eternal reminder of how flames had claimed him, and merely withstand it. Too exhausted for opposition, too deteriorated to remember that resistance had ever been possible. On the final night, though naturally neither possessed the mental architecture to recognize it as final, Jack arrived earlier than usual. Sunset had barely concluded. The corridor's fluorescent panels hadn't yet transitioned to their nocturnal dimness. Nurses were still conducting evening medication rounds when the stench commenced. When temperature began its ascent, when that wet, dragging friction announced his approach. Nurse Calloway noticed this time. Actually noticed the reek of ash and incinerated matter seeping beneath Margaret's door. Noticed how the hallway temperature plummeted when she approached within 10 feet of the room. Noticed the trail of something dark and viscous extending from the elevator to Margaret's threshold. She stood motionless outside, hand resting on the handle, her rational mind attempting and failing to construct plausible explanation. And for one crystalline instant, she felt the presence of something beyond that door that violated every natural law she'd built her worldview upon. Then her pager chirped. Mr. Tanaka had collapsed in the bathroom. She pivoted away, convinced herself the odor was indeed faulty heating after all, that she'd submit a maintenance request tomorrow, that whatever she'd sensed was simply fatigue combined with the peculiar emotional heaviness inherent to working somewhere people came to forget how to exist. Inside the room, Jack hauled himself toward Margaret's bed, with movements suggesting his already destroyed body was deteriorating further. Fragments of him crumbled away as he advanced, ash and char cascading like black snow, leaving ever darker trails behind. His remaining eye had clouded almost entirely now, that milky film obscuring whatever vision still remained. Yet he located her regardless, hauled himself onto the mattress through some awareness that transcended optical perception. And for the final time, he encircled her with his arms. Margaret produced a small sound, not quite terror, more an expelled breath given shape by vocal cords that had forgotten their function. Then silence. She registered the familiar scorching heat, the familiar compression of that embrace, the familiar impossibility of a form that shouldn't exist clutching her with agonizing gentleness. But tonight felt different. Tonight, in the microscopic space between heartbeats, in the infinitesimal gap between neural impulses, in that fleeting instant before disease obliterated awareness once more, she felt it. The devotion beneath the nightmare. The vow honored beyond any rational boundary. The love that had outlasted death and combustion and metamorphosis into horror itself. Jack, her Jack, the man who'd stood beside her before a house that no longer existed and sworn never to let her face darkness alone, who'd plunged back into inferno because he believed she needed him, who'd perished burning because love outweighed self-preservation, who'd returned every single night since, despite her screaming, despite her revulsion, despite the soul-crushing torment of being perceived as abomination by the only person who'd ever mattered, because a promise was sacred and love was eternal, and some things survived even annihilation. She felt it, comprehended it, maintained that comprehension for perhaps 5 full seconds. An eternity by the metrics of her fractured consciousness. Before dementia incinerated the understanding once more. But in those 5 seconds, her muscles released their perpetual tension. Her respiration deepened and steadied. And her hand, moving with deliberate purpose for perhaps the first time in months, rose and touched his devastated face with something unmistakably resembling affection. Jack produced a sound that would have destroyed anyone who heard it. Not quite weeping, not quite exhaling, something carrying recognition and relief and grief so bottomless it seemed to materialize physically in the space between them. She knew him. For those 5 seconds, she truly knew him. Then her hand descended, her breathing pattern shifted. The moment evaporated, but Jack's grip intensified. He held her as her biological systems commenced their terminal cascade, as her cardiac rhythm stuttered and failed, as her lungs abandoned their mechanical purpose, as the electrical configurations in her brain that had once constituted Margaret Corso began dissolving into white noise. He held her as she died, held her through the crossing from existence to whatever waited beyond. His charred arms cradling her with infinite care, his scorched arms enfolding her with infinite gentleness, his destroyed face buried against her throat, murmuring his careful Margaret repeatedly in that fractured voice, honoring his vow, never abandoning her to solitude, remaining present until the final synapse discharged and the final neuron extinguished, and the vessel that had contained the woman he loved finally ceased all movement and grew cold within his grip. And then, for the first time since the night flames had consumed him while trying to reach her, Jack released her. His arms loosened their hold. His form, what persisted of it, what had been sustained by nothing except willpower and dedication, and the reality-defying endurance of love, began disintegrating. Not spectacularly, not with combustion or radiance or any conventional indicators of metaphysical transition. Simply quietly, dissolving into ash that floated through darkness like falling snow, settling across bedding and floor, and her cooling form in configurations that could have been random or could have spelled messages in languages only the departed could decipher. When Nurse Calloway finally entered, summoned by some inexplicable instinct, some awareness that something fundamental had shifted, had concluded, she discovered Margaret Corso's body resting peacefully in a bed blanketed with ash. More ash than any heating malfunction or ventilation issue or rational source could possibly produce. Ash coating every surface like the residue of cremation. But Margaret's expression beneath the gray powder looked tranquil, more at peace than Calloway had witnessed during all the months she provided care. And on her cheek, the ash had been disrupted, cleared in vertical streaks running from eye to jaw, as though something wet had carved pathways through the fine powder, as though she'd wept in her final moments, or as though someone else had wept over her. Calloway stood paralyzed, her flashlight beam scanning across the mattress, and she perceived what her mind immediately attempted to reject, attempted to rationalize as optical illusion or coincidence or exhaustion-induced hallucination. But it existed, undeniable, preserved in the uniform layer of ash covering the sheets, two distinct silhouettes. One small, slender, Margaret's body positioned on her side, and wrapped around it, perfectly captured in ash like a photographic negative, the outline of something larger. Arms curved around her torso, legs bent to cradle hers, the impression of a head pressed against her neck, of a form curved protectively around her own in an embrace that had persisted until the ash finally settled. The outline of someone who'd been holding her when death arrived. Someone who'd remained until the absolute end. Calloway's hand trembled, the flashlight beam wavered. For several elongated seconds, she simply stood there, staring at evidence of something impossible, something that shattered every principle she'd been trained to accept about reality's nature and death's finality, and what boundaries actually separated the living from the dead. Then she switched off her flashlight, backed quietly from the room, and closed the door with reverent care. Some things demanded silence. Some mysteries deserved protection. Some love transcended explanation. The official documentation recorded natural causes, expected progression of advanced dementia, cardiopulmonary failure consistent with her age and condition. The ash was noted as environmental contamination of unknown origin and attributed to potential HVAC malfunction. The room was professionally cleaned, sanitized, prepared for its next occupant, and nobody ever mentioned the outlines preserved in that ash. Nobody spoke of the impossible embrace. Nobody acknowledged what Calloway had witnessed, because some truths are too sacred for paperwork. Some promises are too profound for documentation. Some devotion is too absolute to survive rational scrutiny. Margaret and Jack had made vows decades earlier, in front of witnesses, before a house that no longer stood, promising to remain together through everything existence could offer, through joy and suffering, through health and sickness, through life and death. They'd kept those promises, every single one, even when memory failed, even when flesh burned, even when horror replaced recognition. The vows endured, the love persisted, the promise was honored, and in the end, in that final sacred moment when Margaret's awareness flickered back, just long enough to truly see him one last time, it was all worth it. Every agonizing night, every rejected embrace, every scream of terror, because love that profound doesn't measure cost. It simply gives, forever, without condition, without end. Even death couldn't stop it. Especially death couldn't stop it. Some promises transcend mortality. Some love refuses to die. And somewhere beyond the beige walls of Riverside Care Center, beyond the boundaries of understanding, beyond the limits of what we accept as possible, they're together, finally at peace, finally recognized, finally home, together, just as they promised, forever. Then she extinguished her flashlight, activated the overhead fluorescents, and in their merciless glare, the silhouettes became less defined, easier to reinterpret as optical phenomena, shadow play, exhaustion-induced misperception. She summoned Dr. Rahman and initiated the administrative protocols that would formally document Margaret Corso's passing, recording time of death, circumstances, clinical observations, omitting the details that refused to fit onto standardized forms. The evidence suggesting someone, something, had accompanied her through that final crossing. The ash was removed, disposed of according to biohazard regulations. The room was stripped, disinfected, staged for whoever would occupy it next. The incident dissolved into Riverside's relentless operational rhythm. Forgotten, filed away, reduced to data points in a medical chart. But sometimes, late at night when corridor lights dimmed to their amber pulse, and the building settled into its particular quality of stillness, Nurse Calloway would pass the room that had belonged to Margaret Corso. And she'd detect something. Just a whisper, just a fragment. Smoke and charred protein. And beneath that, something else entirely. Something that could have been devotion. If devotion could survive incineration. If devotion could persist beyond every conceivable limit. If devotion could honor vows that death itself should have dissolved. Something suggesting certain connections were powerful enough to endure anything. Even nightmare. Even oblivion. Even the absolute end of everything. Because love like that doesn't die. It transforms. It adapts. It finds a way. Always. Forever. Without exception. And somewhere in the space between what we know and what we can't explain, in that liminal territory where promises become eternal and devotion transcends physical form, Margaret and Jack remain. Together, whole, recognized, home, exactly as they vowed. Through everything, beyond everything, forever. Story 2, What the Boy Fed Santa. The first time Wesley mentioned the breathing, his father was halfway through his second cup of coffee. Not imaginary friends, not monsters under the bed, not the usual childhood anxieties that arrived gift-wrapped in darkness. Breathing, coming from inside the fireplace. Neil Garrison set down his mug with more force than intended, stared at his 6-year-old son kneeling on the hardwood floor, face pressed so close to the glass fireplace doors that condensation bloomed with each exhale. Wheezed back up from there. The boy didn't acknowledge him, just knelt there, small, pale, unnervingly still in that way he had when something captured his complete attention. One hand splayed flat against the glass like he was feeling for vibrations. Wesley, This time the kid blinked, surfaced, turned those dark eyes, Carla's eyes, toward his father with an expression that made Neil's stomach tighten for reasons he couldn't articulate. Not fear exactly. Recognition, maybe. Like the boy had discovered something he'd been expecting to find all along. "There's breathing in there," Wesley said. Matter of fact, reporting observable data. Neil crossed the living room and crouched beside him, joints popping in protest, pressed his own ear against the cold glass and listened. Nothing. No air movement, no whisper of draft, just the dead acoustic of sealed brick and accumulated soot. "I don't hear anything, Bud." It stopped. Wind doesn't stop. It's not wind. Wesley's voice carried that calm certainty that only children possess when they absolutely know something adults refuse to see. Wind doesn't stop and start. This does. It waits. The hair on Neil's forearm stood at attention. They'd closed on the house 3 months earlier, August in North Texas, when every surface radiated stored heat like a convection oven, and the idea of wanting a fireplace seemed clinically insane. But Carla had loved the neighborhood, good schools, low crime, tree-lined streets where people still waved from their front porches, the kind of suburb where you didn't deadbolt your door until after the 10 o'clock news. The house itself dated back to 1967, built during that brief era when fireplaces still meant something in Texas, not for actual warmth, for the Norman Rockwell aesthetic of it, the fantasy. The chimney ran straight up through the structure's center like a brick spine. The fireplace opening was deep and wide, fronted with smoky glass doors some previous owner had retrofitted in the 80s. Neil had inspected it before signing, aimed his flashlight up into the darkness beyond the damper, saw nothing but soot-blackened brick disappearing into shadow. The home inspector had been even more dismissive. Damper rusted shut, flue sealed, nothing to worry about unless they actually wanted to use it. They didn't. Who needed fire when October still hit 90 degrees? But November arrived colder than forecasted. By Thanksgiving, nighttime temperatures were plunging into the low 40s. The house responded to the cold differently, settling into itself with creaks and sighs, breathing almost through its aging joints. That's when Wesley started spending time in front of the fireplace. Neil would emerge from his home office for coffee refills and find the boy there, kneeling, watching, listening to something no one else could hear. It was the Monday after Thanksgiving when Wesley first verbalized what he'd been observing. And now, 3 days later, he still wouldn't stop talking about it. "There's something living in there," Wesley announced at dinner, fork hovering over untouched mac and cheese. Carla's eyes met Neil's across the table. That look married people develop, entire conversations compressed into a glance. "Sweetie, the chimney's sealed," she said gently. "Nothing can get in there." "It didn't get in." Wesley's tone remained maddeningly reasonable. "It's always been there." Neil felt his jaw tighten. "Wheeze, there's nothing in the fireplace except old soot in. It breathes differently than us." Silence settled over the table like settling ash. "What do you mean differently?" Carla asked. Wesley considered the question with that unsettling focus he brought to everything. The same intensity he applied to watching nature documentaries, to building elaborate block structures that he'd dismantle completely if a single piece sat wrong. "Slower," he finally said, "and it holds the breath longer, like it's trying to hear us too." That night, after Wesley was asleep, Neil found Carla standing in front of the fireplace with her arms crossed, studying it like it might reveal something under sustained scrutiny. "We should get someone out here," she said without turning around. "The inspector already. A chimney specialist. Someone who actually knows what they're looking at." Neil felt exhaustion pulling at him. "Carla, it's sealed. There's nothing up there except 40 years of creosote buildup." "Then why does our son keep insisting he hears something?" "Because kids invent things, you know that. Imaginary friends, monsters under beds, elaborate reasons why vegetables are poisonous." "Wesley doesn't invent things." She was right, and they both knew it. Their son wasn't imaginative in the traditional sense, didn't engage in pretend play, didn't create elaborate fantasies. Last week Neil had found him in the backyard, crouched over an ant hill, methodically dropping potato chip fragments one at a time, and observing how the ants responded to different flavors. Wesley observed, analyzed, reported findings. He didn't make things up, which meant either something actually was in the chimney, or something far more concerning was happening inside their son's head. Wesley wasn't the kind of child who invented things. That's what kept circling through Neil Garrison's mind as he watched his 6-year-old son kneel motionless before their fireplace for the third consecutive afternoon. Not imaginary friends, not elaborate fantasies about why bedtime was negotiable or vegetables were actually poison. Wesley observed, documented, drew conclusions based on evidence, which made what he'd been saying for the past week considerably more unsettling. There's something breathing in there. The house on Mercer Drive had good bones. That's what the realtor kept emphasizing during the walkthrough. Built in '67, when fireplaces still carried cultural weight in Texas. Not for actual heating purposes, for the aesthetic, the fantasy of gathered family and crackling logs that no one would ever actually burn because who needed fire when September still hit the mid-90s? They'd closed in August, paid more than Neil thought reasonable, but Carla insisted the neighborhood justify the premium. Top-rated schools, negligible crime statistics, tree-canopied streets where neighbors still made eye contact. The kind of suburb where locking your front door before the 10 o'clock news felt almost paranoid. The chimney formed the house's central column, a brick spine running from basement to roofline. The fireplace itself gaped wide and deep, retrofitted sometime in the '80s with smoky glass doors that made it look more decorative than functional. Neil had inspected it before signing, aimed his phone's flashlight up past the damper into darkness, saw nothing except soot-stained brick vanishing into shadow. The home inspector had been equally dismissive. Dampers rusted solid, flues sealed. You'd need serious work to make this operational again. Fine by Neil, they had central heating. But November arrived with unexpected teeth. By Thanksgiving week, nighttime temperatures were diving into the low 40s. The house responded to cold differently than heat, settling into itself with groans and whispers, contracting, almost breathing through its aging infrastructure. That's when Wesley developed his new fixation. Neil would emerge from his home office, eyes burning from spreadsheets, desperate for caffeine, and find the boy there, kneeling on hardwood, face centimeters from the glass doors, breath creating expanding circles of fog. Listening. We stepped back from there. No response. The kid remained frozen, one small palm pressed flat against glass like he was checking for a heartbeat. Wesley. The boy blinked, surfaced from wherever his attention had tunneled, turned those dark eyes, carbon copies of his mother's, toward Neil with an expression that triggered something primal in his father's hindbrain. Not guilt, not embarrassment at being caught doing something forbidden. Certainty. There's breathing inside, Wesley reported. Clinical, observational. Neil crossed the room, knees popping as he crouched beside his son, pressed his own ear against cold glass. Nothing. No airflow, no whisper of draft, just the dead acoustic of sealed space, brick and accumulated carbon and 40 years of disuse. I don't hear anything, buddy. It stopped when you got close. Neil felt his patience fraying. Wind doesn't stop and start. It's not wind, that unnerving calm again, that absolute conviction. Wind is constant, this waits. The fine hairs along Neil's arm stood erect. Wesley wasn't an imaginative child. That's what made this so concerning. He didn't engage in pretend play, didn't create elaborate narratives about his action figures. Last week, Neil had discovered him in the backyard, crouched over an anthill with surgical focus, systematically dropping different flavored chip fragments and documenting which varieties the ants preferred. "What are you doing?" Neil had asked. "Testing variables," his 6-year-old had replied without looking up. Wesley analyzed, categorized, drew evidence-based conclusions. He didn't fabricate stories, which meant either something genuinely was producing sound in that sealed chimney, or their son was experiencing auditory hallucinations. Neither option was comforting. "We should get someone out here," Carla announced that evening, standing before the fireplace with arms crossed, studying it like it might confess under interrogation. The inspector already cleared it. A chimney specialist, someone who actually knows what they're looking at. Neil rubbed his eyes. "Carla, it's sealed. There's nothing up there except decades of creosote." "Then explain why our son keeps insisting he hears something." "Because kids invent things. You know this, monsters under beds, imaginary friends, elaborate theories about why homework is optional. Wesley doesn't invent things." Truth hung between them like suspended smoke. Their son didn't make things up. He observed reality and reported findings, which left them with two equally disturbing possibilities. Carla pressed her lips together in that particular way, the expression that meant she disagreed but was choosing to table the argument for later compilation. She'd been doing that more frequently lately, cataloging grievances, storing them for some future reckoning. "I'll call someone," she said, "just to be safe." But she didn't. Days spun forward in their familiar rhythms, work and school and dinner, and the slow gravitational pull toward Christmas. Wesley continued his vigil, every afternoon kneeling before the glass doors, sometimes for hours, face pressed close, listening to something no one else could detect. Neil told himself it was harmless, a phase. Kids developed weird fixations and then abandoned them just as mysteriously. Wednesday afternoon, Neil came home early. Found Wesley in the kitchen, standing on a chair at the counter, the Tupperware container open, the one where Carla stored homemade cookies for school lunches. "What are you doing?" Wesley climbed down without answering, cradled 3 chocolate chip cookies against his chest, walked with purpose toward the living room. Neil followed. The boy knelt before the fireplace and opened something Neil hadn't even noticed before, a small cast iron cleanout door at the base, maybe 6 inches square, designed for removing accumulated ash. Wesley placed the cookies inside one at a time, arranging them with careful precision, then closed the door and pressed his ear against it. Listening. Wheeze, what are you doing? The boy looked up, leaving them for Santa. Neil felt his stomach drop. Buddy, it's not Christmas yet. Santa comes down the chimney on Christmas Eve. I know, Wesley's tone remained maddeningly reasonable. But Santa's here early this year. He's been here since Thanksgiving. Something cold crawled up Neil's spine. What makes you think that? Wesley turned back to the clean-out door, because I can hear him breathing, and sometimes he talks. The boy paused. He says he's hungry. The first time Neil heard it himself, Carla had taken Wesley to the dentist. He was alone in the house, standing in the living room with bourbon he'd poured but hadn't yet tasted. The house settled into that particular quality of silence, unique to empty homes. And then it changed. Sound emerged from inside the fireplace. Soft, wet, labored, like air being drawn through a partially collapsed windpipe. In, out, rhythmic struggling. Breathing. Neil positioned his glass on the coffee table with surgical precision, felt his pulse hammering against his temples like something trying to escape. He approached the fireplace the way you'd approach a suspicious package left unattended in an airport. Slowly, every sense hyper-alert for sudden movement. The glass doors reflected nothing but the darkened living room behind him. Beyond them, deeper shadow, pure black. The breathing persisted. In, out, in. Rhythmic, labored, undeniably organic. Hello, his voice emerged small, ridiculous, like calling out to check if a burglar was still in your house. The breathing ceased immediately. Neil stood motionless for 60 full seconds, listening to his own cardiovascular system working overtime. Then it resumed, quieter now, more distant but unmistakable. The sound of lungs functioning. He should have opened those doors, should have looked inside and confirmed the source, eliminated the mystery with direct observation. But something fundamental in his nervous system, some ancient survival circuit, screamed a warning. Once you open that barrier, you can't restore it. You can't unlearn what's waiting on the other side. Instead, he called a chimney specialist. The technician, who arrived 2 days later, introduced himself as Eddie Polk, 60-something, thick through the middle with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades peering into darkness. He spread protective tarps across the hardwood and assembled his equipment with practiced efficiency. Asked about recent fires. Haven't burned anything, Neil said. Inspector told us the flue was sealed years ago. Eddie nodded like he'd heard this before. Probably a bird, maybe a squirrel. They work their way down looking for shelter. Can't figure out how to climb back up. He adjusted his headlamp. Happens more than you'd think. What happens to them? Eddie's response was matter of fact. They don't survive. Wesley materialized in the hallway, partially concealed behind the corner. Neil had explicitly told him to stay in his bedroom, but the boy had a gift for appearing in doorways, silent and watchful as a predator. His fingers tapped against the wall, slow, deliberate rhythm that triggered something in Neil's memory, something he couldn't quite identify. Eddie unsealed the glass doors. Smell escaped immediately, not overpowering, not yet, but present, organic, fundamentally wrong in ways Neil's vocabulary couldn't quite capture. The technician aimed his flashlight up into the flue, examining the damper mechanism, the sooted brick walls, the narrow vertical shaft climbing toward the roofline. Then he reached upward, his entire arm disappearing into the opening. Dampers jammed solid, he muttered. Something lodged in the frame. He adjusted his position. Not a bird too substantial, maybe a raccoon that. He stopped, went completely still, then yanked his arm back and stood up fast enough that his knees cracked audibly. His face had drained to the color of old newsprint. "What?" Neil heard the edge in his own voice. "What did you see?" Eddie stripped off his work gloves with trembling hands. When he spoke, each word arrived carefully measured, controlled. "I need to make a phone call." "What's up there?" "Don't touch anything." Eddie wouldn't make eye contact, just kept repeating it like a mantra. "Don't open those doors again. I'll be back in 20 minutes. He left without packing his equipment, without explanation, without looking back. His truck peeled out of the driveway, fast enough to leave rubber on the pavement. Neil stood paralyzed in the living room, staring at the unsealed fireplace, at the darkness pooling inside it like spilled ink. Wesley had drifted closer, standing at the tarp's edge now. His fingers had ceased their rhythmic tapping. He'd gone completely motionless, watching his father with those unsettling, inward-focused eyes. "I tried telling you," the boy said quietly. Silence stretched between them. "Then is Santa in trouble?" Neil tried responding, but his vocal cords had locked. He just stared at this small person he'd helped create, attempting to see past familiar features into whatever machinery operated underneath. Why would Santa be in trouble? Neil finally forced words out. "Wheeze, have you been talking to whoever's in there?" The boy nodded with zero hesitation. "I've been giving him cookies through the little door since Monday because he said he was hungry." Neil's lungs forgot how to function. "What did he say to you?" Wesley recited it with perfect recall. "He said thank you every time, called me a good boy, said I'd get extra presents this year." The child paused. "If I was really good and didn't tell mommy and daddy." The room contracted. Air thickened into something harder to breathe. Neil could hear the kitchen clock ticking, could hear his own respiration synchronizing with something else, something emanating from inside the fireplace. Did Santa ask for anything else? Wesley nodded. "Water, yesterday, but I couldn't reach the sink." His expression remained eerily calm. "So I gave him apple juice instead, from my lunchbox, through the little door." Neil felt his stomach trying to climb his esophagus. "He drank it really fast," Wesley continued. "Made sounds like crying, but he said they were happy sounds, that Santa gets emotional sometimes." The boy's face shifted, thoughtful, analytical. "I don't think Santa's supposed to cry, though." Eddie returned 40 minutes later with 2 patrol officers and a fire captain named Bennett who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. They congregated in the Duttons' living room discussing protocols and jurisdictional authority, and who possessed the legal power to authorize controlled demolition of a chimney breast, while Neil and Carla listened with the numb incomprehension of people being informed. Their foundation was built over a sinkhole. "What is going on?" Carla's voice had climbed half an octave. "Someone needs to explain what's happening right now." Captain Bennett delivered the news with the expression of someone about to tell a child. Their pet had been hit by a car. "There's a person in your chimney." The words hung in the air like particulate matter. Wedged in the flue, approximately 8 feet up, stuck solid, can't move his arms, can't get leverage to push himself back up or slide down. Neil heard himself ask, "How?" Best we can figure came down from your roof. Attempted burglary. Miscalculated the dimensions. Bennett gestured toward the fireplace. That flue was built in the 60s when average male body size was smaller. He got himself jammed. And once you're stuck in a confined vertical space like that, every breath just compresses you tighter, like those Chinese finger traps. Carla's hand found Neil's, gripped it hard enough to hurt. Is he dead? No, ma'am. We can hear him breathing. He's been attempting to communicate, but we can only make out fragments. Is he dead? Bennett's jaw worked. No, ma'am. We can hear respiration. He's attempted verbal communication, but most of it's unintelligible. He paused. He keeps asking for the child, asking if the child is still there. The floor seemed to drop away beneath Neil's feet. Bennett continued in that careful, professional monotone people use when delivering catastrophic news. They'd need to breach the chimney breast to extract him. EMS was en route. The individual would require immediate emergency intervention. Severe dehydration, probable hypothermia, possibly crush syndrome from sustained compression. He produced a notepad. I need to ask about your son, about the communication. Neil's mouth had gone desert dry. Wesley thought. He believed it was Santa Claus. The voice asked for food and water, and Wesley's been providing it, through the clean-out door. Bennett's gaze shifted to Wesley, who returned it without blinking, without any visible emotion whatsoever. Your boy's smart, the captain said quietly. Probably kept that man alive. Another 72 hours without hydration and we'd be extracting a corpse. They were evacuated from the living room, while the fire crew assembled their equipment. Neil and Carla sat at the kitchen table listening to power tools shriek through brick, watching masonry dust drift through the air like fallout from some distant disaster. Wesley was upstairs in his bedroom, where Neil had banished him with explicit instructions not to emerge. Carla stared at her interlaced fingers, knuckles bleached white from pressure. I don't understand. Her voice barely qualified as sound. Wesley told us almost 2 weeks ago. Why didn't we? We called Eddie, Neil said, defensive, already knowing how hollow it sounded. After 10 days, her voice climbed half an octave. 10 days, Neil. What if he died? What if that man died because we didn't believe our son? Neil opened his mouth, closed it because she was right. The guilt settled between them, like sediment in stagnant water. They should have known, should have investigated immediately, should have believed. Their 6-year-old had been more perceptive than 2 adults with college degrees, and mortgages and retirement accounts. The screaming began around 3 o'clock, not mechanical screaming, not power tools biting through mortar. Human screaming. The sound erupted when the crew breached the compression point, when they started attempting extraction from the vertical shaft, where a human being had been wedged for 14 days. High-pitched at first, thin, almost childlike. Then it escalated into something that transcended language, that bypassed the parts of the brain responsible for processing human vocalization, and went straight to the amygdala screaming, run, run, run. The sound of a creature whose conception of itself as human had been literally compressed away, leaving only animal panic and the biological imperative to survive at any cost. Carla clamped her hands over her ears. Neil sat motionless, listening to a man disintegrate, thinking about Wesley kneeling before that fireplace for 2 weeks, carefully feeding cookies through a cast-iron door, believing he was helping Santa Claus, believing he was earning extra presents for being good. The screaming degraded into wet, gasping sounds that were somehow exponentially worse. Then silence, the sound of respiratory systems malfunctioning, of a larynx that had lost the architecture required to produce recognizable speech. Then nothing. Absolute silence more terrible than the screaming had been. They extracted him on a gurney, body secured with multiple restraints, oxygen mask obscuring most of his face. Neil glimpsed him as they wheeled past. Skeletal, filthy beyond description, skin the gray-white of something discovered beneath rotting lumber. His eyes were open, vacant, focused on nothing. But his hands kept moving, fingers twitching in small, compulsive patterns against the straps, reaching, grasping at empty air, searching for something that wasn't there. One paramedic was speaking low to Captain Bennett. Neil caught fragments: massive compression trauma, critical dehydration, probable septicemia, severe psychological damage. And then the phrase that cemented itself in Neil's consciousness: may never be able to articulate what he experienced. After the ambulance departed, sirens Dopplering into distance, a detective named Hargrove arrived to document their statements. Younger than Neil anticipated, carrying that particular exhaustion belonging to people who'd witnessed sufficient darkness to understand it was ubiquitous, who'd learned to transport it professionally. Victim's name is Dale Wickham, Hargrove began, consulting his notes. Outstanding warrants across 3 counties, mostly, some narcotics charges. Probably targeted your residence due to the setback from the street, good concealment from neighbors. Likely surveilled your departure patterns. Accessed your roof via the oak tree in your backyard. Attempted the chimney entry. He paused. Except your flue dimensions are narrower than modern standard. Built when average body mass was smaller, he wedged himself. And in confined vertical spaces, each inhalation creates compression, like those finger traps. The more you struggle, the tighter it gets. Carla's hand found Neil's beneath the table. Timeline puts initial entry on Thanksgiving evening, when you were visiting family. Hargrove's pen hovered. That's approaching 2 weeks ago now. We thought something died in the walls, Carla said, her voice barely functional. The smell. Hargrove's pen stopped moving entirely. You weren't wrong. He flipped a page. I need to speak with your son. Officers mentioned he initially reported the sounds, that he'd been providing food and water through the access panel. I understand he's young, but he had direct contact with the victim. Standard protocol requires documentation. He's 6 years old, Neil protested. He doesn't comprehend what happened. Hargrove closed his notepad, met Neil's gaze directly. Your son is the only person who communicated with the victim. We need his account for the case file. Wesley descended the stairs with deliberate slowness, 1 step at a time, hand trailing along the banister. When he reached the kitchen, he studied the detective with that same analytical calm, that interior focus that had always unsettled Neil. Hargrove softened his voice. Hi, Wesley. I'm Detective Hargrove. I need to ask you some questions about the person who was in your chimney. Is that okay? The boy nodded. Can you tell me when you first heard sounds coming from the fireplace? The Monday after Thanksgiving. No hesitation, clinical precision. Around 4:30 in the afternoon. And what did you hear? Breathing, different from regular breathing. Slower, with spaces between inhale and exhale. Hargrove wrote carefully. Did you tell your parents? Yes, that same day. And every day after. They said it was the furnace or wind or my imagination. The detective's gaze flicked toward Neil. No judgment, just notation. When did you start leaving food? Monday. The breathing voice said he was hungry, said he was Santa and needed help getting strong enough to climb back up. Said if I helped him and didn't tell Mommy and Daddy, I'd get extra presents. Something cold spread through Neil's chest. Did you believe it was Santa? Wesley considered this with that unnerving thoughtfulness. At first, but Santa wouldn't ask me to keep secrets. Teacher says adults who ask kids to keep secrets are breaking the rules. Hargrove's pen stopped, but you kept feeding him anyway. Yes. Why? Wesley's answer came simply, logically, because he said he was hungry, and it seemed mean to let someone starve just because they lied about being Santa. The kitchen went silent. Hargrove cleared his throat, set down his pen. You probably saved that man's life, Wesley. You know that. The boy's expression didn't change. He was crying when he drank the juice. Not happy crying, scared crying. I think he thought he was going to die in there. He probably was, Hargrove said quietly, until you helped him. Wesley nodded, accepting this information, processing it with that same analytical detachment he brought to observing anthills. Then, is he going to jail now? Eventually, after the hospital. Good, Wesley's voice remained flat, factual. He broke into our house, and he lied about being Santa. Those are both against rules. After Hargrove left, after the fire crew finished boarding up the demolished chimney breast, after the evidence technicians photographed everything and departed, the house settled into a new kind of silence. Not the comfortable quiet of before, something else, something that held residue. That night Neil found Wesley in his bedroom, not sleeping, just sitting on his bed in the darkness, staring at the wall. Hey buddy, you okay? I don't think Santa's real, Wesley said. Not upset, just concluding based on available evidence. The man in the chimney wasn't Santa, and if Santa was real, he would have helped the man get out. Neil sat beside him. No, Santa's not real. I thought so. Wesley was quiet for a moment. Did I do something bad by feeding him? No, you did something kind. You helped someone who was suffering. Even though he was a criminal. Even though. Wesley processed this. Teacher says we should help people even when they're not nice to us. Is that true? Neil felt something break open in his chest. Yeah, Wheeze, that's true. The boy nodded, satisfied with this answer. Then Dad. Yeah. I'm glad he's not in there anymore. The breathing was really scary, especially at night. Neil pulled his son close, felt the small body against his. Alive, safe. Me too, buddy, me too. They never used the fireplace. Even after repairs, even after the chimney was professionally cleaned and certified, even after winters arrived that would have justified it. The glass doors remained closed, sealed, because some spaces, once contaminated by certain kinds of horror, never feel clean again. And some sounds once heard never truly stop echoing. Late at night, when the house settled into its particular rhythms, Neil would sometimes pause in the hallway and listen, just to confirm the silence was complete, just to verify nothing was breathing where nothing should be breathing. It never was, but he checked anyway, every night, just to be sure. Hargrove's voice remained gentle, almost apologetic. Can you tell me what you heard coming from the chimney? Breathing, Wesley replied. Same clinical precision. starting the Monday after Thanksgiving. After we got back from Grandma's house, I reported it to my parents immediately. Did you hear anything besides breathing? Something crossed the boy's face. There and gone in a microsecond. A calculation occurring behind those dark, inward-focused eyes. A decision being reached. Yes, a voice spoke to me. Hargrove leaned forward fractionally. What did it say? That he was Santa Claus. That he'd gotten stuck during an early delivery because he wanted to personally verify I was on the nice list. Wesley's tone remained absolutely neutral, reporting observable facts. He said if I helped him without informing my parents, I'd receive additional presents on Christmas. What kind of help did he request? Sustenance, water. He explained Santa requires fuel for toy manufacturing, so I provided cookies from the kitchen and juice from my lunchbox, daily, after school, through the small door at the bottom. Neil felt nausea rising. He told you that door was for elf deliveries? Hargrove asked. Correct, for supply drops when Santa travels long distances. Did the voice ever sound hurt, frightened? Wesley considered this with that unsettling deliberation. Sometimes it produced sounds resembling crying, but he explained that Santa becomes emotional during the holiday season because of his profound love for children. The sounds indicated happiness that I was assisting him. And you believed this explanation? Wesley met the detective's gaze without blinking. Of course, Santa wouldn't deceive children. The statement hung in the air like suspended ash. After Hargrove departed, after the fire crew finished cleanup and the final patrol car pulled away, after Carla retreated upstairs with a damp cloth pressed over her eyes and the bedroom door closed, Neil stood alone in the living room, staring at the wound they'd carved into the chimney breast. The breach sat approximately 6 feet up, a ragged cavity the size of a medicine cabinet. Interior bricks coated black with decades of soot and something else. Something organic that reflected the afternoon light with wet gleam. The space where Dale Wickham had been imprisoned measured barely 2 feet across. A vertical coffin that narrowed toward the top to perhaps 18 inches. Neil tried imagining 2 weeks compressed inside that darkness. The slow, crushing realization that no rescue was coming, that he would die there, slowly, alone, forgotten. Except rescue had come, in the form of a 6-year-old, with chocolate chip cookies and apple juice. A child who'd reported the problem for 2 weeks while the adults dismissed him. A child who'd shown more compassion than his parents, more action than his father. Who'd kept a stranger alive through simple, persistent kindness, even after discovering that stranger had lied to him. Neil sank onto the couch, put his face in his hands, and wept, not for Dale Wickham, who'd broken into their home and manipulated their son. For Wesley, for what this would do to him eventually, when he was old enough to fully process it. When the weight of it settled into his consciousness, and he understood he'd spent 2 weeks feeding cookies to a dying man trapped in their chimney, while his parents told him it was nothing. While his father dismissed his concerns as imagination. The living room filled with shadows as afternoon bled into evening. And somewhere upstairs, a 6-year-old boy sat in his bedroom, processing the fact that Santa Claus wasn't real. That adults lied. That even when you did everything right, even when you were kind and helpful and good, the world remained fundamentally wrong in ways no amount of cookies could fix. Neil stayed on that couch until full darkness arrived. listening to his house breathe around him, making sure the breathing was only the house, only ever the house, nothing more. Wesley materialized beside him, silent as displaced air. Is Santa going to be okay? Neil looked down at his son, at those dark, inscrutable eyes that observed and categorized and constructed frameworks for understanding reality that Neil couldn't begin to decode. That wasn't Santa, buddy. His voice came out rougher than intended. That was a bad man, someone who tried breaking into our house. But the voice said he was Santa. The man lied. Bad people sometimes lie to children, especially when they're frightened, when they're trapped and think maybe if kids believe them, they might get help. Wesley's head tilted, processing, filing this data into whatever internal architecture he'd constructed for making sense of the world. Why would he lie? Because he was terrified, stuck in agony, and he thought if you believed he was Santa, you'd help him. I did help. Yeah, Neil's throat constricted. You did. You probably saved his life. Detective Hargrove said so. Wesley's gaze shifted back toward the wound in the chimney, that dark vertical shaft climbing toward the roof line. His small hand extended. Fingers traced the jagged edge of broken brick. So I was talking to a liar for 2 weeks. His voice had gone very quiet, very flat. Something primitive in Neil's nervous system started screaming warnings. Yes. Wesley nodded slowly, absorbing, integrating. Liars shouldn't get cookies. The statement landed with the weight of a sentencing. No, Neil heard himself say. I guess they shouldn't. Wesley continued nodding, processing with that methodical precision he brought to everything. Then he turned and walked away, heading upstairs toward his bedroom. Neil watched him go, watched that small form disappear around the corner, and felt ice spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with December air flowing through the demolished chimney. The smell didn't fade. Contractors arrived the following day, sealed the breach with fresh brick, matched mortar as closely as possible to the original. But the odor persisted, sweet, organic rot emanating from the chimney's core structure like radiation from contaminated soil. Carla deployed air fresheners, scented candles, ran the air purifier on maximum setting, opened windows despite freezing temperatures. Nothing helped. The contractor explained when she called, demanding answers. Old chimneys are porous, especially these mid-century builds. Whatever happened in there for 2 weeks, it soaked into the masonry, deep. You'd need to demolish the entire structure down to foundation to eliminate it completely. The estimate he provided made Neil physically nauseous. They decided to endure it, but the smell intensified. By the second week of December, it had metastasized throughout the first floor, colonizing furniture and curtains, infiltrating carpet fibers. Their mail carrier started abandoning packages on the porch instead of ringing the doorbell. Neighbors stopped returning Carla's waves. The house had become contaminated, marked, a place where something terrible had occurred and left permanent residue. Wesley stopped speaking. Not completely. He still responded to direct questions, still participated in required activities. But the casual conversation, the random observations about ants or cloud formations, or how many steps between his bedroom and the kitchen, ceased entirely. He'd retreated somewhere interior, somewhere his parents couldn't follow. Carla scheduled an appointment with a child psychologist. Dr. Chen listened to their account with practiced empathy, explained that Wesley had experienced trauma, that discovering he'd been manipulated by an adult, even an adult in distress, could fundamentally alter a child's trust architecture. She recommended weekly sessions. But when Wesley sat in Dr. Chen's office, he answered every question with perfect politeness and zero emotional content. Yes, he understood the man had lied to him. No, he wasn't angry about it. Yes, he felt fine. No, he didn't have nightmares. Dr. Chen told Carla and Neil that some children process trauma by compartmentalizing, by creating internal distance from the event, that Wesley might need time before he could fully engage with what had happened. She didn't mention what Neil had started suspecting, that maybe Wesley had already processed it, had drawn his conclusions, and those conclusions were sitting inside him like unexploded ordnance. Waiting. Christmas came and went in muted tones. They put up a tree, hung stockings, went through all the traditional motions. But Wesley barely responded to his gifts, opened them with mechanical efficiency, said thank you with perfect manners and zero enthusiasm. On Christmas night, Neil found him in the living room, sitting cross-legged in front of the sealed fireplace, just sitting in darkness, staring at the new bricks. "Wheeze, what are you doing?" The boy didn't turn around, listening. Neil's pulse accelerated. For what? To make sure he's really gone. "Buddy, he's in the hospital." "He's not." "Not him." Wesley's voice remained eerily calm. "The breathing, I want to make sure it stopped." Neil crouched beside his son, put a hand on his small shoulder. "There's no breathing, Wheeze. It's sealed, empty, nothing in there." Wesley finally looked at him, and the expression in those dark eyes made Neil want to recoil. "You didn't believe me before," the boy said simply. "When I said there was breathing, you said it was my imagination. Why should I believe you now?" No accusation in his tone, just logic, pure reasoning. Neil had no answer. They sold the house in March. Took a significant loss, but staying had become impossible. The smell, the memories, the way Wesley would sometimes stop whatever he was doing and tilt his head, listening for something no one else could hear. The new owners were a young couple, pregnant with their first child, thrilled to find something in their price range in such a good school district. During the final walkthrough, the woman asked about the fireplace. "Does it work?" Neil and Carla exchanged a look. "It's sealed," Neil said. "Hasn't been used in years." "Oh," she sounded disappointed. "We were hopping to use it. There's something so cozy about a real fire, you know." "Yeah," Neil said, "we know." They signed the papers and left. Didn't look back. Wesley never talked about what happened. Not to therapists, not to his parents, not to anyone. He grew up quiet, observant, excelled academically, particularly in subjects requiring logical analysis. Made few friends, trusted even fewer people. And every Christmas, without fail, he would go completely silent for exactly 2 weeks. December 1st through December 14th. The anniversary of when a man named Dale Wickham had been trapped in a chimney, slowly dying, while a 6-year-old boy fed him cookies through a small iron door. While that boy's parents dismissed his concerns as imagination. While the man manipulated that boy's kindness with calculated lies. Neil tried talking to him about it once, when Wesley was 16. "You know what you did was incredibly compassionate, right? You saved someone's life. Wesley had looked at him with those same dark, unreadable eyes. I fed a liar who broke into our house for 2 weeks because I believed what adults told me. He paused. I won't make that mistake again. And he hadn't. Wesley learned his lesson thoroughly. About trust, about belief, about the gap between what people say and what's actually true. He learned it trapped between childhood innocence and adult deception. He learned it feeding cookies to Santa Claus, while Santa slowly suffocated 8 feet above his head. Some lessons leave permanent marks. Some scars never fully heal. And some smells, no matter how thoroughly you try to eliminate them, never truly go away. They just sink deeper into the structure, into the foundation, into the parts of yourself you can't access to repair. And they stay there, forever, breathing, waiting, reminding you that once, just once, you trusted completely and learned exactly what that trust was worth. The smell didn't fade. Contractors arrived the following day, sealed the breach with fresh brick, matched mortar as closely as possible to the original. But the odor persisted, sweet, organic rot emanating from the chimney's core structure like radiation from contaminated soil. Carla deployed air fresheners, scented candles, ran the air purifier on maximum setting, opened windows despite freezing temperatures. Nothing helped. The contractor explained when she called demanding answers. Old chimneys are porous, especially these mid-century builds. Whatever happened in there for 2 weeks, it soaked into the masonry, deep. You'd need to demolish the entire structure down to foundation to eliminate it completely. The estimate he provided made Neil physically nauseous. They decided to endure it, but the smell intensified. By the second week of December, it had metastasized throughout the first floor, colonizing furniture and curtains, infiltrating carpet fibers. Their mail carrier started abandoning packages on the porch instead of approaching the door. Carla's book club, scheduled for that Tuesday, quietly relocated to someone else's residence. No explanations offered, none required. The message transmitted clearly. Something had corrupted the Dutton home. Something had perished there, or nearly perished, and the structure retained memory of it. Wesley appeared unaffected. He'd abandoned his fireplace vigil entirely after the extraction, returned to his standard routines, constructing, observing, existing in that interior space only he could access. His block architecture grew increasingly elaborate. Towers and archways and geometries that seemed to violate physical laws but somehow maintained structural integrity through microscopic precision. But occasionally Neil would discover him positioned before the sealed chimney, head angled, listening. "What are you doing?" "Nothing." "Do you hear something?" Wesley would regard his father with an expression that resembled pity. "Not anymore." December 18th. Carla was performing her weekly cleaning of Wesley's bedroom, something she insisted on despite his protests, when she located the bottle beneath his bed. Hers, an expensive French fragrance Neil had purchased for their anniversary. The container was completely drained, atomizer still attached but bone dry. She descended the stairs, gripping it like prosecution evidence, face rigid with barely restrained fury. "Wesley, did you take this?" The boy glanced up from his blocks. He'd been engineering something complex and architectural, multi-level structure with internal corridors. No. Carla's voice climbed. It was under your bed. $150 bottle completely empty. Where did it go? Maybe it was already empty. It wasn't. I used it last week. It was nearly full. Wesley fitted another piece with studied precision. Maybe someone else took it. Carla stared. Who else would possibly take it? The boy returned his attention to construction. Maybe whoever took the hamburger from the garage freezer. Neil had been observing from the kitchen threshold. Now he entered fully. What hamburger? The one in back, the one that turned brown. When did you notice it missing? Wesley looked up. I didn't notice I took it. Silence crashed down like falling masonry. Carla was staring at their son with an expression Neil had never witnessed before. Something transcending confusion, transcending anger, approaching genuine fear. Why would you take hamburger from the freezer? Wesley explained with methodical calm while positioning another block. For Santa, the voice said he was hungry. Cookies were adequate for snacks, but he required substantial food. He said Santa needs protein for pulling the sleigh. Neil felt ice spreading through his intestines. When did you give it to him? Week ago, maybe longer. And he ate it. Wesley paused, considering. Not immediately. It smelled wrong. But I told him Santa has to consume whatever children provide or he doesn't get to leave the chimney. Those were the rules. Neil's voice came out strangled. What rules? Wesley met his father's gaze, those dark eyes absolutely calm. The ones I invented. The voice said they weren't legitimate rules, but I explained they were legitimate in this house. I told him if he didn't comply, I'd stop bringing food. A beat of silence. So the voice ate it. Carla collapsed onto the sofa like her skeletal system had failed, still clutching the empty perfume bottle, rotating it mechanically in her hands. And the perfume. The voice smelled terrible after eating the meat, really terrible, worse than before. So I sprayed him with Mommy's perfume to improve the odor. Wesley's tone remained clinical, observational. The voice didn't appreciate that either. He cried extensively, but it worked. Eventually he smelled like flowers instead. Neil crouched to eye level, moving slowly, carefully, like approaching something dangerous. Wheeze, did you know the spoiled meat might make him sick? The boy considered this with his characteristic thoroughness. The hamburger was brown, slimy. Mommy always discards meat when it looks like that. Pause. So yes, I knew. Neil's mouth had gone dry. Why did you give it to him? Wesley fitted another block into position with micrometric precision. Because the voice said he was hungry. Another pause, longer this time. And because I wanted to observe what would happen. They contacted Detective Hargrove that evening. He returned with his familiar exhausted courtesy, but his eyes had changed, sharper now, more vigilant. He settled at the kitchen table while Neil and Carla alternated explaining what they'd uncovered, what Wesley had disclosed, the timeline they'd reconstructed. Hargrove listened without interruption, taking notes in his meticulous handwriting. When they concluded, he sat in silence for an extended period, studying his notebook like it might decode itself. Finally, he spoke. The victim survived, Dale Wickham. He's in ICU at Presbyterian. Hargrove's pen tapped against paper. Multiple organ failure, severe septic infection, profound psychological trauma. He's barely coherent most hours, but when he surfaces, he repeats the same phrase continuously. The detective met their eyes. Santa's not real, Santa's not real, over and over like reciting scripture. He paused. Medical team attributes it to sepsis-induced delirium, but I've been doing this work long enough to recognize terror when I see it. Another pause. That man isn't delirious. He's traumatized. Something happened in that chimney beyond physical confinement. Something that broke him psychologically. Carla's voice emerged barely above whisper. What are you saying? Hargrove closed his notebook. I'm saying your son didn't just feed a trapped man. He conducted an experiment with variables, with controls, with deliberate observation of outcomes. He looked toward the living room, where Wesley sat constructing his elaborate architecture. And I'm saying that man in the ICU, criminal or not, is terrified of a 6-year-old child. Because that child taught him something about powerlessness, about manipulation, about what happens when someone small and innocent decides to see what suffering looks like up close. Neil felt reality tilting. What do we do? Hargrove stood, gathered his materials. You get your son professional help, immediately, not just trauma counseling. Comprehensive psychological evaluation. He moved toward the door. Because what he did wasn't kindness that happened to cause harm. It was deliberate cruelty disguised as help, and children who understand that distinction at age 6. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They found a specialist, Dr. Reeves, 15 years working with children who exhibited concerning behavioral patterns. She evaluated Wesley over 6 weeks, administered tests, conducted interviews, observed his interactions. Her final assessment arrived in a sealed envelope. Neil and Carla read it together at the kitchen table. The language was clinical, professional, but the conclusion was unmistakable. Wesley demonstrated advanced cognitive empathy, the ability to understand others' emotional states, but showed marked deficits in effective empathy, the capacity to actually feel those emotions himself. He could predict how someone would react to spoiled meat or perfume spray. He simply didn't care about the suffering those reactions would cause. He was curious about pain, the way other children were curious about ant colonies. As something to observe, document, analyze. Dr. Reeves recommended intensive intervention, specialized therapy, close monitoring. She also noted something else. Wesley showed no remorse, no guilt, no recognition that what he'd done was wrong beyond the abstract understanding that adults disapproved. He'd followed the logic perfectly. Trapped man said he was hungry. Feeding him was helpful. Observing outcomes was scientific. That the outcomes included agony and terror and psychological breakdown simply didn't register as relevant. They sold the house in March. Started fresh somewhere else. Somewhere without chimneys, without dark vertical spaces where things could hide. Wesley continued therapy, learned appropriate behaviors, mastered the social performance of empathy, grew up successful, well-adjusted by external measures. But Neil never stopped watching him, never stopped looking for signs of that same clinical curiosity, that same detached observation of suffering. And sometimes, late at night when the house settled into silence, Neil would remember his 6-year-old son explaining why he'd fed spoiled meat to a dying man. I wanted to see what would happen. Said with the same tone, other children used to explain why they'd mixed baking soda and vinegar. Pure scientific inquiry. No malice, no empathy. Just observation. And Neil understood then. what Hargrove had been trying to tell them, that some children learned compassion through experience, some learned cruelty through trauma, and some, a very small percentage, came pre-programmed with neither. Just curiosity about cause and effect, about actions and consequences, about what happens when you systematically torture someone who can't escape. Not because you hate them, not because they hurt you, simply because you want to know. And you have the opportunity to find out. Wesley was one of those children. The chimney hadn't made him that way. It had simply provided him his first laboratory, his first test subject, his first experiment in applied suffering. And he documented the results with the same precision he brought to everything else. Methodically, thoroughly, without a single moment of hesitation or doubt. Because to Wesley, Dale Wickham wasn't a person. He was a variable. In an experiment about what happens when you feed someone rotting meat and spray them with perfume while they slowly suffocate in darkness. Santa wasn't real, but the monster who tortured him while pretending to help. That monster was very real. 6 years old, with dark eyes that watched everything and learned exactly what he wanted to know. He's traumatized. That man experienced something inside your chimney that shattered him psychologically. Carla's voice emerged threadbare, barely sound. What do we do? Hargrove's response came with uncomfortable honesty. I don't know. Your son is 6. Legally, that age presumes incapacity, inability to comprehend consequence. The law doesn't recognize culpability in children that young. Wesley understood. Neil heard himself speak. He knew precisely what he was doing. Hargrove held his gaze for several seconds, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I believe that. After the detective departed, Neil and Carla remained motionless at the kitchen table. Above them, the delicate clicking of blocks being assembled, the careful construction of something they couldn't observe but could sense taking form. Carla finally broke the silence. We need to find him help, a therapist, a psychiatrist, someone who specializes in. She couldn't complete the sentence. Something inside Neil fractured. All the control he'd been maintaining for days suddenly gave way. In what? His voice climbed. Children who torture people, kids who run experiments on dying men. Don't say that. He was up there every single day for 2 weeks, alone with a man trapped in our chimney, testing him, withholding water to measure endurance limits, feeding him contaminated meat to observe outcomes, creating arbitrary rules and enforcing them like some researcher studying insects. Neil's hands were shaking. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, is that Wesley enjoyed it. Did you see his expression when he was describing it? No fear, no confusion, no guilt, just disappointment. Carla was weeping silently now. Disappointment that his experiment terminated before he could gather more data. Neil wanted to comfort her, couldn't make his body cooperate. He felt excavated, scraped hollow, nothing remaining except the echo of whoever he'd been before Thanksgiving. He's our son, Carla whispered. I know. We love him. I know. We'll get him help. We'll fix this. Her voice splintered on the final word. We have to fix this. Neil looked at her across the scarred kitchen table. This woman he'd shared 8 years of marriage with, and saw the same question reflected in her eyes that had been circling his consciousness for days. What if we can't? He said quietly. What if this isn't something that happened to him? What if this is just what he is. The clicking sounds continued overhead. Precise, methodical, patient. Building something they couldn't see. Something they might never understand. Christmas Eve arrived gray and bitter. Temperature plunging into the 20s. Sky the color of old concrete. The kind of cold that penetrated walls and settled into bones and made everything feel fragile. They'd canceled their usual traditions. No extended family gathering. No church service. No elaborate dinner preparation. The house felt like a crime scene, wearing holiday decorations. Tree standing in the corner with its lights unplugged. Stockings hanging empty over the sealed fireplace. Wrapped presents stacked beneath the tree that no one had the energy to move. Wesley seemed unaffected by the subdued atmosphere. He'd constructed an enormous structure in the living room, some kind of tower and corridor system that occupied nearly 6 square feet of floor space. Used every block he owned and had started incorporating other household items, coasters, remote controls, Carla's decorative stones from the bathroom. The architecture defied normal logic, seemed to violate gravitational principles, but held together through microscopic precision of placement. Neil watched him work with a sick fascination he couldn't name. The boy's focus was absolute, his small hands moving with surgical exactness, placing each component with the care of someone diffusing explosives. "Wheeze, what are you building?" "A chimney, matter of fact, no inflection." Neil's blood turned to ice water. "Why?" Wesley fitted another piece into position. To understand how it works, the vertical shaft, the compression points, the places where something could get stuck. He paused, examined his construction from multiple angles. "I want to see if I can design one that's better." "Better how?" "Harder to escape from." The statement landed like a physical blow. Carla had entered from the kitchen, frozen in the doorway, face drained of color. "Wesley," her voice cracked, "why would you want to make it harder to escape?" The boy looked up with those dark, bottomless eyes. "For testing. If I build another one someday, I want to make sure it works properly." Silence expanded to fill every cubic inch of available space. "Testing what?" Neil heard himself ask. Wesley returned his attention to the structure. How long different things can survive in confined spaces, how they react to variable conditions, temperature changes, limited oxygen, psychological pressure. He placed another block with micrometric care. The chimney was an accident, not controlled. Too many unknown factors. Next time I want to design the environment specifically for observation. Neil couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was hearing. "Next time," Carla's voice had gone hollow. "What do you mean next time?" Wesley didn't look up. "When I'm older, when I have my own house, I can build proper testing facilities with cameras, recording equipment, ways to measure biological responses accurately." He examined his work with satisfaction. "The voice in the chimney taught me a lot, but there's so much more I want to learn." They called Dr. Reeves on Christmas Day. Emergency session. Could she see Wesley immediately? This couldn't wait until after the holiday. She agreed, cleared her schedule, met them at her office that afternoon. Evaluated Wesley for 3 hours, while Neil and Carla sat in the waiting room holding hands so tightly, their fingers went numb. When Dr. Reeves finally emerged, her expression was carefully neutral, professionally composed. But her eyes told a different story. She asked to speak with them privately, In her office, without Wesley present, they sat in chairs designed for comfort that felt like instruments of torture. Dr. Reeves organized her notes, took a breath, began speaking in that measured clinical tone that meant bad news was coming. Your son demonstrates several concerning patterns. Advanced cognitive function combined with significant empathy deficits. He understands emotional cause and effect intellectually, but shows no effective response to suffering. She paused. In simpler terms, Wesley knows what hurts people. He can predict their reactions with remarkable accuracy. He simply doesn't care about the pain those reactions cause. Neil felt something inside him collapse. What does that mean? Dr. Reeves chose her words carefully. It means Wesley processes other people as objects of study rather than as conscious beings worthy of moral consideration. He's intellectually curious about suffering the way other children are curious about how machines work. Carla was crying again, silent, devastating. Can you fix it? She whispered. The doctor's silence stretched too long. I can teach him behavioral controls, social performance, how to simulate empathy convincingly enough to function in society. She met their eyes, but changing the underlying architecture, making him actually feel what he currently only understands intellectually. Another pause. I've been doing this work for 17 years, and in my professional opinion, no, that's not something therapy can repair, because it's not broken, it's just how he's wired. The words settled like fallout. So what do we do? Neil asked. You teach him rules, boundaries, consequences. You monitor him constantly. You never leave him unsupervised with anyone or anything vulnerable. You accept that he'll learn to perform normalcy well enough to pass, but underneath that performance, she didn't finish. Didn't need to. Underneath the performance, Wesley would remain exactly what he was. A 6-year-old conducting experiments on suffering, who'd just been interrupted mid-study, and was already planning his next project. With better controls, more accurate measurements, improved facility design, learning from his mistakes, preparing for the future, when he'd have his own house, his own space, his own subjects, and no one to stop the research. They left Dr. Reeves's office as the sun set on Christmas Day. Wesley sat in the backseat humming something tuneless, content untroubled, planning his next chimney, his next experiment, his next opportunity to observe what happens when something helpless encounters something inescapable, and learns exactly how long it takes to break. Christmas Eve descended with oppressive cold, sky the color of wet cement pressing down on everything. Neil's mother phoned about the weather, apologizing, canceling her visit. They'd celebrate after New Year's instead. Neil told her not to worry, could hear the relief flooding her voice. The chimney no longer existed, demolished to the roofline, opening sealed with plywood and weatherproofing. The entire brick column extracted from the living room center. What remained was a crude patch of fresh drywall, unpainted, waiting for spring when they might have the resources, financial and emotional, to finish it properly. The stench had finally begun dissipating, though occasionally at night Neil detected traces. That sweet, putrid density suggesting organic decomposition and human agony absorbed into porous masonry. But perhaps that was merely psychological residue. Perhaps odor, like trauma, could persist long after its source had been eliminated. Wesley spent Christmas Eve morning constructing. He'd received upgraded blocks as an early gift, double the quantity of his previous set, with specialized connectors and pivot points enabling significantly more complex architecture. He'd been engineering something elaborate for days, something consuming most of his bedroom floor space. Neil stood in the doorway, observing. The boy's focus was total, absolute. Small hands positioning each component with exacting precision. No experimentation, no errors, just systematic observation and methodical assembly of something that existed first as pure concept, then piece by piece as physical reality. What are you building? Wesley didn't glance up. A chimney. I spread through Neil's chest cavity. Why a chimney? The boy continued his meticulous work, connecting two vertical columns with a horizontal span. Because now I comprehend how they function. They're not exclusively for Santa. They're for anything requiring entrapment in a specific configuration. He placed another piece with surgical care. The geometry matters. The narrowing at the summit matters. But the distance from base to constriction point, that's the critical variable. Neil's throat had closed. Why is that critical? Wesley looked up, met his father's gaze with those bottomless dark eyes. Because that's where hope extinguishes. When you can still observe the opening below but can no longer reach it. When you know precisely how distant safety is, but simultaneously know you'll never arrive there. A pause, devastating in its calm. That's the component that matters most. Neil couldn't produce sound, stood paralyzed, staring at his 6-year-old son, articulating the architecture of despair with the same clinical precision he applied to documenting insect behavior. He finally managed words. Wheeze. Do you understand Mr. Wickham was an actual person, not Santa, a real human being with family and existence in? Yes, I understand. Do you understand he experienced genuine pain, suffering? Yes, Wesley returned to construction. He cried extensively, especially after consuming the meat. Initially the crying was loud, but after several days it diminished, became more like whimpering. The boy's hands never stopped moving, never faltered. Like an injured dog, too exhausted for barking anymore. Neil felt reality fracturing around him. Didn't that make you want to stop, to tell someone who could help? Wesley considered this while placing another block with micrometric accuracy. No. Why not? Because stopping would mean not discovering what happened next, and I wanted to know what happened next. The casual delivery made it somehow worse, made it unbearable. What did happen next? Wesley's construction continued, precise, methodical, unstoppable. He stopped being a person, became only sounds, respiration and weeping and occasionally words, but the words lost coherence, just became noise. Pause. That's when it became boring. I preferred when he could still communicate, when he'd say, "Thank you for the cookies," and call me a good boy and promise gifts. Once he couldn't maintain the pretense anymore, the interesting part ended. Neil's legs gave out. He collapsed onto Wesley's bed, unable to support his own weight. You knew he was pretending. The boy glanced at his father. Obviously, Santa isn't real. You and Mommy explained that last year when I asked, but the man didn't know I knew, and that created the interesting variable, observing how long he'd maintained the deception even while suffering. Wesley fitted pieces together with absolute confidence. watching him make his voice sound cheerful when I could hear him crying between words. That was the experiment. Neil's voice emerged strangled. What experiment? How long someone can pretend to be something they're not when they're desperate enough. Wesley's tone remained utterly neutral, reporting findings. Answer: a very long time, almost until the end. He only stopped pretending after I gave him the contaminated meat. After that, he couldn't maintain the performance anymore. Silence filled the room like rising water. Downstairs, Neil could hear Carla preparing Christmas dinner no one would eat. Could hear the television broadcasting cheerful holiday programming that belonged to some alternate universe. Could hear his own cardiovascular system functioning, mechanical, relentless, keeping him alive whether he wanted continuation or not. Wesley, his voice came out careful, controlled. You need to understand something. What you did, keeping Mr. Wickham's secret, providing spoiled food, observing his suffering that hurt him, genuinely injured him. He's hospitalized now, may never recover fully. I understand. Does that make you feel bad? Sad that you caused someone harm? Wesley stopped building, went completely motionless for several seconds, head tilted, examining his own internal landscape with that same analytical attention he brought to external observation. Then, no, the word landed with absolute finality. It doesn't make me feel bad. It makes me feel curious. He resumed construction. I want to know what permanent damage looks like, how his brain changed from the experience, whether he'll develop specific phobias or if the trauma will manifest differently. Wesley placed another block. I want to know if he'll ever stop saying, Santa's not real. If that phrase becomes permanently embedded or if it eventually fades. That's data I can't access from here, but I'm documenting predictions for future reference. Neil couldn't breathe, couldn't process, couldn't reconcile this small person, this child he'd helped create, with the words emerging from his mouth. You're talking about him like he's a science project. Wesley looked up, genuinely confused. He is a science project. People are just variables with more complex responses than ants, but the methodology is identical. Introduce stimulus, observe reaction, document findings, adjust parameters for next iteration. He returned to his chimney model. Mr. Wickham was useful, but the experimental design had flaws, too many uncontrolled factors. Next time I'll need better isolation, more precise measurement tools, maybe video recording for behavioral analysis. Next time. The words barely made it past Neil's lips. When I'm older, when I have access to better facilities, better subjects. Wesley examined his construction from multiple angles. Mr. Wickham taught me a lot, but there's significantly more to learn about pain thresholds, psychological breaking points, how long consciousness persists under various deprivation conditions. He smiled slightly. Not happiness, something else, something that made Neil want to flee the room. I have years to plan, to design proper experimental protocols, to identify optimal subjects who won't be easily missed. Wesley placed the final block on his model chimney. Perfect, complete, exactly as designed. The world is full of people no one cares about. People who disappear and everyone assumes they just moved away or relapsed or chose to leave. Those are the best subjects because no one comes looking. No one interrupts the data collection. He turned to his father. I just need to be patient, learn, practice. Wait until I'm old enough to have privacy. Then I can conduct real research. Controlled, documented, meaningful. Those dark eyes held Neil's gaze. Mr. Wickham was an accident, a teaching moment, but next time won't be an accident. A pause. Next time will be intentional. Neil stood, walked from the room on legs that barely functioned, descended the stairs, found Carla in the kitchen, surrounded by food she was mechanically preparing. "We need to leave," he said, voice flat, dead. She looked up. "What?" "We need to pack, now, tonight. We can't stay in this house with him." "Neil, he's our son." "No," the word came out harsh, certain. "Whatever's upstairs in Wesley's room building a model chimney and planning his next experiment, that's not our son anymore. Maybe it never was. Maybe we just didn't see it until the chimney gave him an opportunity to show us what he really is." Carla was crying. "We can get him help," Dr. Reeves said. Dr. Reeves said she could teach him to pretend, to perform empathy convincingly enough to pass for normal. Neil gripped the counter. "She said the underlying architecture can't be changed. And she's right, because I just listened to our 6-year-old explain his research methodology for torturing people. Talk about selecting subjects who won't be missed. Plan his next experiment for when he's old enough to have privacy." He looked at his wife. "That's not illness. That's not trauma. That's just what he is. And keeping him here, raising him, supporting him, giving him the resources to grow stronger and smarter and more capable, that makes us complicit in whatever he does next." Silence. Carla stared at him, processing, understanding slowly dawning like toxic sunrise. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we have two choices. We can stay, pretend everything's fine, monitor him constantly for the next 12 years and hope we catch every single dangerous impulse before he acts on it. Hope he never slips, never finds an opportunity, never hurts anyone else." Neil's voice was shaking now. "Or we can accept that we're not equipped to handle this, that keeping him here puts everyone around him at risk, that the responsible thing, the only thing, is to get him into a facility designed for children like him, where professionals can watch him every second, where he can't access victims. You want to institutionalize our son. I want to protect everyone else from what our son is becoming." The kitchen clock ticked, marking seconds, minutes, the time passing while they debated what to do about the monster they'd created. Upstairs, blocks clicked together with precision. Wesley building his future, one careful piece at a time. Planning, learning, waiting for the day when no one could stop him anymore, when the experiments could finally begin in earnest, when he'd have his own house, his own chimney, his own subjects, and all the time in the world to discover exactly how much suffering a human being can endure before the person inside them finally, completely, breaks. Christmas morning arrived wrapped in false cheer. They opened presents with mechanical precision, going through rituals because that's what families did on December 25th, because stopping would require acknowledging why they wanted to stop. Wesley received a bicycle, several books, the upgraded block set he'd already been utilizing, and a teddy bear, brown plush with black button eyes and crimson ribbon encircling its neck, ordered weeks ago by Neil's mother from some catalog, before everything changed. Wesley accepted it, studied its face with that characteristic analytical focus, then set it aside and returned his attention to the bicycle. They attempted normalcy. Carla prepared ham. Neil activated the stereo, classic holiday standards. Bing Crosby and Nat King Cole crooning about snow and sleigh bells and the transformative power of belief. They consumed dinner in the dining room, pretending the crude drywall patch in the living room didn't exist, that their son remained just their son, that nothing fundamental had shifted in their lives' architecture. But it had shifted irreversibly. They all understood this. They sat eating ham and sweet potatoes and manufacturing conversation, while the knowledge of what Wesley actually was occupied the table with them like an uninvited presence. After dinner, while Carla cleaned dishes, Neil retreated to the garage. They had firewood stored there, a cord he'd purchased in October when temperatures first dropped, when they'd briefly contemplated using the fireplace before deciding it required too much effort. He loaded an armful, carried it to the living room. The fireplace remained despite the chimney's demolition. The opening persisted, bricked over at the back where contractors had sealed the flue, but the hearth itself intact. Glass doors removed during demolition and never replaced. Just a cavity now, a dark hollow in the wall. Neil constructed a fire. Something to do, something normal, something fathers did on Christmas evening when winter assaulted the windows, and the house felt simultaneously too empty and too full. The wood was seasoned, caught quickly. Soon flames climbed against sealed brick, heat radiating outward, light dancing across walls. Wesley entered from the kitchen, holding the teddy bear, observing the fire with those dark, inward-focused eyes. "Come sit by the fire, Wheeze, it's warm." The boy didn't move, just stood there studying the flames the way he studied everything else. Ants in the backyard, block tower structural integrity, the sounds Dale Wickham produced while suffering. From the kitchen, running water, clattering dishes, Carla humming something off-key, trying to flood the silence with manufactured normalcy. Christmas music still playing too loud, attempting to drown what they all knew but couldn't verbalize. And then Neil heard it, or believed he heard it. A sound from the fire, high, thin, almost melodic. Sap boiling in unseasoned wood, resin popping, moisture trapped in brick expanding under heat. That's what it was, had to be. But in Neil's mind, scraped raw by 3 weeks of accumulating dread and the knowledge of what his son had done, it resembled screaming. Like someone drawing air through a crushed windpipe. Like Dale Wickham enduring 2 weeks of compression and darkness and a child's voice asking questions, always questions, while dropping things through the grate to observe outcomes. Neil stood abruptly from the couch, heart hammering. But Wesley was already moving, walking toward the fireplace with that same calm, purposeful stride. Teddy bear dragging behind him across carpet, ribbon leaving faint trails. Neil started to call out. The sound intensified, or seemed to. Crackling of combusting wood, hiss of heat expanding through aged mortar, residue of whatever Dale Wickham had left behind now burning and releasing its particular chemistry. That's all it was, molecules, physics, predictable behavior of matter under thermal stress. But it sounded like screaming. It sounded exactly like screaming, rising to a frequency that made Neil's teeth ache, made his vision blur, made him understand with sudden terrible clarity that this was something he'd hear for the remainder of his life. In quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking, in every fireplace he ever witnessed burning. Wesley stood very close to the flames now, unbothered by heat, watching with those bottomless dark eyes. He lifted the teddy bear, studied its face one final time. The button eyes, the stitched smile, the innocence of it. Then tossed it into the fire. Synthetic fur ignited immediately, melting and carbonizing, stuffing inside blooming with flame. Button eyes popping in the heat with sharp little sounds like miniature bones fracturing. The crimson ribbon curled and vanished into smoke, and the sound from the fire escalated, became something that wasn't quite crackling wood anymore. A wet, guttural noise that Neil's traumatized consciousness insisted was Dale Wickham still imprisoned somewhere in the brick's molecular structure. His suffering recorded in mineral form, and now being released again through heat and light and smoke. Carla materialized in the doorway, dish towel still gripped in her hands. She stopped when she saw Wesley standing there, fire reflecting in those dark eyes, teddy bear burning in the hearth. Her face transformed, color draining, understanding settling like toxic sediment. She started to say, "Wesley, get away from." Stopped when she saw his expression. Stopped when she comprehended what that expression meant. Or didn't mean. The absolute absence of guilt, of fear, of anything recognizable as human empathy. The sound reached crescendo, then cut off suddenly, replaced by normal fire sounds, crackling, popping, the whisper of flames consuming wood. The moment passed. Reality reasserted itself. It had just been moisture in the wood, just physics, just Neil's traumatized mind perceiving patterns in chaos. But Wesley continued watching, calm, attentive, as the teddy bear burned down to nothing. Carla looked at Neil, really looked at him, maybe for the first time since Thanksgiving. Her eyes asking a question neither wanted to answer. Her hands trembled around the dish towel, twisting it into knots. "Did you see him throw the bear in?" Her voice barely qualified as sound, nearly lost beneath too loud Christmas music still emanating from the kitchen. Neil nodded slowly. The fire was already burning. "Yes." "You built it while he was in the other room?" "Yes." They stood there, the three of them arranged in a triangle around the fireplace, husband, wife, son, while what remained of the teddy bear smoldered in embers, and smoke climbed against sealed brick, where Dale Wickham had spent the final 2 weeks of his sanity. Wesley reached for the remote on the coffee table, aimed it at the television, increased volume on the cartoon playing, something bright and cheerful about talking animals having adventures. The sound flooded the living room, drowning the fire's crackle, the drip of melting synthetic fur, the silence between his parents that screamed louder than any voice. Neil tried to move, to reach for his son, to do something that might alter what was happening or what had already happened or what would inevitably happen next. But his legs refused cooperation. He stood paralyzed, watching Wesley settle onto the couch with remote still in his small hand. Carla's breathing had gone shallow, rapid. She remained gripping the dish towel, knuckles bleached white around fabric, eyes fixed on Wesley's profile illuminated by dancing firelight. Neil could see her searching for words, some phrase that would make this make sense, make it stop, make it anything other than what it was. But there were no words. The boy didn't look at either parent. He sat motionless, attention fixed on the television, face peaceful and blank and empty of everything except that calm interior focus. After a moment he spoke, voice flat, matter of fact, barely audible over cartoon animals singing. "It's okay." Pause. The fire crackling, The cartoon characters celebrating friendship. I asked for a new one this year anyway. Another pause, longer this time. Wesley's eyes never left the screen. That one was broken. The fire burned lower. Smoke thinned and dispersed. In the kitchen, Christmas music continued. Bing Crosby singing about white Christmases and dreams and all the good things that happen when you believe in magic. Neil felt Carla's hand find his in the darkness between them. Her fingers were ice cold, trembling. But she held on tight. And he held back. And together they stood there watching their son, who was 6 years old and small for his age, and developing normally according to the pediatrician. Their son who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's habit of going very still when thinking. Their son who built impossible structures and watched nature documentaries with unnerving intensity, and who had spent 2 weeks conducting an experiment on a dying man. Their son who understood exactly what he'd done. Their son who felt nothing about it at all. Outside, the December night pressed against windows. Wind picked up, rattling eaves, whistling around the sealed opening where the chimney used to be. The house settled and creaked, breathing in its own way, adjusting to its new shape. The shape left behind when something essential is removed and nothing good takes its place. Wesley reached for another cookie from the plate on the coffee table. He ate it slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving the bright screen where cartoon animals sang about friendship and adventure and all the good things that happen when you believe. The fire burned lower. The teddy bear was gone. The smell remained. And somewhere in a hospital across town, Dale Wickham lay in intensive care, whispering the same phrase over and over to nurses who thought it was delirium. Santa's not real, Santa's not real, Santa's not real. While a 6-year-old boy sat in a living room eating cookies, watching cartoons, planning his next experiment, his next chimney, his next subject, waiting patiently for the years to pass, for the day when he'd be old enough to build his own house, with his own spaces, his own dark places where things could get stuck, where hope could die at precisely calculated distances, where he could finally conduct proper research, with better controls, better documentation, better subjects, people no one would miss, people who would disappear, and everyone would assume they just moved away, just drifted off somewhere else, just stopped existing because that's what happens to people on the margins. And no one would come looking. No one would interrupt. No one would save them. Just like no one had saved Dale Wickham. Not until it was too late. Not until the damage was permanent. Not until Santa stopped being real, and all that remained was the memory of a child's voice in darkness. Asking questions. Always asking questions. While feeding you things that hurt. While watching what happened next. While documenting your breaking with the same calm precision he brought to everything else. The fire died. The music stopped. The cartoons ended. But Wesley kept watching the screen. Kept waiting. Kept planning. Because some experiments take years to design properly. Some research requires patience. Some questions can only be answered when you have the right subject, the right space, the right amount of time. And Wesley had all the time in the world to learn, to grow, to become exactly what he was always meant to be. While his parents stood in the darkness, holding hands, knowing, unable to stop what was coming, unable to change what he was, unable to do anything except wait and hope that somehow, some way, they were wrong about their son, even though they knew they weren't, even though the teddy bear had been broken, even though the smell remained, even though Wesley kept building his chimneys, one careful piece at a time, forever